Welcome, fellow wanderer of the Four Nations, to the complete chronicle of Avatar Aang, the last airbender whose journey would reshape the world forever. Tonight, we explore the extraordinary life of the boy who awoke from a century of ice to find his people gone and his world at war. This is a tale of growth and loss, of friendship forged in fire, and of a gentle soul who learned that sometimes the greatest strength lies in choosing compassion over vengeance. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your mind drift as we traverse the decades together. In the year 12 before the Great Comet, when the world still knew peace and the air nomads danced with clouds above mountains that had never heard the scream of war machines, a child was born who would carry the weight of all four nations upon shoulders barely strong enough to support a glider. His birth came not with fanfare or prophecy spoken aloud, but with the quiet certainty that marks all natural wonders. The way dawn arrives without announcement, inevitable and perfect in its timing. The southern air temple stood as it had for centuries, its spiraling towers reaching towards sky that seemed infinite in its blue vastness. Prayer flags snapped in mountain winds that carried the scent of snow and meditation incense, while the gentle chiming of wind bells provided a soundtrack to spiritual contemplation that had continued unbroken for generations. Into this sanctuary of peace and wisdom came the child who would be called Aang, though the significance of his arrival would remain hidden even from the monks who raised him with such careful devotion. The air nomads understood childhood as a sacred time, a period when the soul remained closest to its essential nature before the complications of adult responsibility created barriers between consciousness and pure being. They believed that children possessed wisdom that formal education could only diminish, that the unguarded heart held truths that scholarly debate would never reach. This philosophy shaped every aspect of Aang's early years, surrounding him with adults who honored his natural curiosity while protecting his innocence from premature exposure to the world's darker realities. Monk Gyatso emerged as the central figure in Aang's childhood, not through official appointment, but through the natural affection that grew between an old soul seeking to share wisdom and a young one eager to receive it. Gyatso possessed the rare ability to be simultaneously teacher and playmate, spiritual guide and fellow adventurer, wise elder and eternal child. His laughter echoed through temple halls as frequently as his prayers, reminding everyone who heard it that joy was as sacred as meditation, that humor was as valuable as solemnity in the pursuit of spiritual understanding. Under Gyatso's guidance, Aang learned to see airbending not as a martial art or tool of power, but as an extension of natural movement, a way of dancing with the invisible currents that connected all living things. His first successful air scooter materialized not through formal instruction but during a moment of pure play, when Gyatso challenged him to find a new way to reach a fruit hanging from a high branch. The sphere of spinning air that carried Aang upward seemed as natural as walking, as inevitable as breathing, marking him as someone who understood his element through instinct rather than analysis. The other young airbenders at the Southern Air Temple initially welcomed Aang as simply another playmate, unaware that his casual mastery of techniques they struggled to learn marked him as fundamentally different from themselves. They played sky bison polo together, their laughter ringing across practice yards, while Appa and the other young bison learned to work in harmony with their human partners. They raced through obstacle courses designed to develop agility and spatial awareness, turning essential training into joyful games that made learning feel like celebration rather than work. But even in these early years, careful observers might have noticed something extraordinary about the way Aang moved through the world. Air seemed to respond to his presence before he consciously directed it, creating breezes that cooled him during exertion, gentle currents that steadied him during difficult maneuvers, pockets of still air that allowed him to hear whispered conversations from impossible distances. The element claimed him as surely as he claimed it, creating a partnership so seamless that distinguishing between boy and bending became meaningless. The bond between Aang and Appa developed through a single moment of perfect understanding that would define both their lives forever. Among the young sky bison at the Eastern Air Temple, Appa stood slightly apart from his siblings, his massive frame already showing promise of the strength and endurance that would make him legendary among his species. When the time came for young airbenders to choose their lifelong companions, Aang approached not with the calculated assessment that others employed, but with simple offering, a single apple extended in friendship toward a creature whose gentle eyes held intelligence that seemed almost human. Appa's acceptance of the gift created more than partnership. It established a bond that transcended the typical relationship between airbender and sky bison. They became extensions of each other, their movements synchronized, their thoughts aligned, their spirits intertwined in ways that made separation feel like losing half of one's soul. Appa's patient strength balanced Aang's impulsive energy, while Aang's adventurous spirit awakened possibilities in Appa that a more cautious companion might never have discovered. The Southern Air Temple became their playground and training ground, its ancient architecture perfectly designed for beings who moved through 3 dimensions, rather than merely across flat surfaces. Aang learned to navigate its vertical spaces with increasing confidence, using airbending to leap between platforms that seemed impossibly far apart, to run up walls that should have been unclimbable, to glide through spaces that required perfect control of air currents and body position. Each successful maneuver built not just physical skill, but the spiritual confidence that would serve him throughout his extraordinary life. Gyatso's teaching methods emphasized understanding over mere technique, encouraging Aang to explore the philosophical foundations that made airbending more than simple manipulation of atmospheric pressure. They discussed the relationship between movement and stillness, the way true power emerged from yielding rather than forcing, the manner in which apparent weakness could become strength when properly understood. These conversations, conducted during long walks through mountain meadows or quiet evenings in temple libraries, provided Aang with intellectual frameworks that would guide his decisions during the most challenging periods of his later life. The air nomad's commitment to vegetarianism introduced Aang to ethical thinking that would profoundly influence his approach to conflict throughout his avatar journey. He learned to see all life as interconnected, to understand that causing unnecessary harm to any creature diminished the spiritual health of the entire world. These lessons were taught not through stern lectures but through daily practice. The careful preparation of meals that honored plant life even while consuming it, the gentle relocation of insects found indoors rather than killing them, the profound respect shown to sky bison and other animals who served as partners rather than possessions. The traditional air nomad approach to education emphasized experiential learning over rote memorization, encouraging children to discover truth through direct observation rather than accepting received wisdom without question. Aang spent countless hours studying cloud formations, learning to read weather patterns in the subtle shifts of air pressure and humidity that preceded major atmospheric changes. He developed an intuitive understanding of wind currents that allowed him to predict how air would behave around obstacles, enabling the complex maneuvers that made airbending appear magical to practitioners of other elements. Travel between the 4 air temples exposed Aang to the full diversity of air nomad culture, while reinforcing their shared commitment to spiritual growth and peaceful coexistence. The Eastern Air Temple, with its dramatic cliffside location and emphasis on scholarly pursuits, provided access to ancient texts and philosophical discussions that deepened his understanding of Avatar history and spiritual responsibility. The Western Air Temple, carved into a mountainside and accessible only by air, demonstrated how architecture could embody airbending principles of harmony with natural forces rather than domination over them. The Northern Air Temple, largest and most populous of the 4 sacred sites, offered Aang glimpses of air nomad governance and decision-making processes that operated through consensus rather than authority, through spiritual guidance rather than political manipulation. He observed council meetings where disagreements were resolved through patient discussion and meditation rather than argument and coercion, where the goal was always finding solutions that honored everyone's needs rather than determining winners and losers through competitive debate. These childhood journeys also introduced Aang to the world beyond air nomad territories, expanding his understanding of human diversity while reinforcing his people's commitment to universal compassion and understanding. In the Earth Kingdom city of Omashu, he formed a friendship with Prince Bumi that would outlast a century of separation and war, demonstrating that genuine affection could transcend cultural differences and political boundaries. Their adventures together, exploring hidden passages beneath the city, devising elaborate practical jokes, philosophical discussions that continued late into the night, provided Aang with his first real understanding that wisdom could wear many masks, that serious truths could be taught through seemingly frivolous play. The friendship with Kuzon in the Fire Nation proved even more significant, offering Aang direct experience of Fire Nation culture during the final years before war transformed it into something unrecognizable. Together they explored volcanic caves, searched for dragons in mountain peaks, and shared the kind of innocent adventures that became impossible once national boundaries hardened into battle lines. Kuzon's warmth and curiosity challenged any stereotypes Aang might have developed about Fire Nation character, preparing him psychologically for the complex moral landscape he would navigate during his later confrontation with Fire Lord Ozai and his family. The creative breakthrough that led to Aang's invention of the air scooter emerged from the playful experimentation that characterized his entire approach to airbending mastery. While other students focused on perfecting traditional techniques handed down through generations, Aang's natural curiosity led him to explore possibilities that had never been formally documented. The spinning sphere of air that could carry him across surfaces at tremendous speed represented more than technical innovation. It embodied the air nomad principle that tradition should inspire rather than limit individual expression. That mastery meant transcending established patterns rather than merely repeating them. This invention marked Aang as someone who understood airbending through intuition rather than analysis, who could perceive possibilities that escaped more methodical students. His air scooter became his signature technique, instantly recognizable and impossible to replicate without the unique combination of creativity and skill that made him unlike any airbender in recorded history. The technique's success encouraged him to continue experimenting, to treat his element as a partner in creative exploration, rather than simply a tool to be wielded according to established protocols. The formal recognition of Aang's mastery through the awarding of airbending tattoos at age 12 represented an achievement unprecedented in air nomad history. The blue arrows that marked his forehead, hands, and feet carried spiritual as well as technical significance, indicating not just superior skill, but deeper understanding of airbending's philosophical foundations. The ceremony that awarded these marks was both celebration and warning, acknowledging exceptional ability while emphasizing the responsibility that accompanied such gifts. The tattoos themselves became part of Aang's identity, marking him instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with air nomad traditions, while serving as constant reminders of the standards he was expected to maintain. They glowed when he entered the avatar state, transforming from simple markings into symbols of cosmic power that connected him to all his previous incarnations. But during his childhood, they represented primarily personal achievement and the respect of teachers who had guided his development with patience and wisdom. The daily rhythms of temple life provided structure that supported Aang's spiritual growth, while preserving the playful energy that made him beloved among both children and adults. Morning meditation sessions taught him to find stillness within movement, to maintain inner calm, even during the most demanding physical activities. Afternoon training periods challenged his developing skills while emphasizing the cooperative rather than competitive aspects of martial arts. Evening gatherings combined storytelling, music, and philosophical discussion in ways that made learning feel like entertainment. Education, like celebration. The air nomads' commitment to preserving their culture through oral tradition meant that Aang absorbed centuries of accumulated wisdom through stories rather than formal lectures. He learned about previous avatars through tales of their adventures and achievements, developing understanding of his potential destiny without the crushing weight that more direct instruction might have imposed. These stories emphasized the human qualities of legendary figures, showing how great deeds emerged from ordinary virtues rather than supernatural abilities beyond normal reach. The music that filled temple spaces provided another avenue for spiritual development, teaching Aang to understand rhythm and harmony as cosmic principles rather than mere aesthetic preferences. He learned to play traditional instruments with the same natural facility he brought to airbending, discovering that musical expression could access emotional truths that words alone could never capture. The songs passed down through generations carried historical information and philosophical insights embedded in their melodies and lyrics, making cultural preservation feel like artistic pleasure rather than academic obligation. As Aang approached his 12th birthday, the peaceful rhythm of his childhood began to shift in subtle ways that would soon transform his entire existence. The adult monks held increasingly frequent private meetings, their conversations dropping to whispers when children approached. The usual flow of visitors between temples decreased, replaced by urgent messengers who arrived under cover of darkness and departed before dawn. Even the animals seemed to sense growing tension, with sky bison becoming restless and lemurs chattering with unusual agitation during their normally peaceful evening gatherings. But for Aang, these changes remained background concerns, peripheral awareness that did not yet threaten the fundamental security that had defined his entire life. He continued to explore new airbending techniques, to strengthen his bond with Appa, to learn from Gyatso's inexhaustible wisdom and humor. The world beyond the temples might be growing darker, but within the sanctuary of the Southern Air Temple, childhood could continue its essential work of preparing a gentle soul for responsibilities that would soon test every lesson learned during these precious years of peace and safety. The boy who played with lemurs and raced through clouds had no way of knowing that his carefree days were numbered, that forces beyond his understanding were preparing to thrust upon him burdens that would transform his life completely. For now, he remained simply Aang, beloved student, loyal friend, master airbender, and child who had found perfect harmony between serious study and joyful play, between individual achievement and community belonging, between spiritual discipline and natural exuberance that made everyone around him smile with pure delight. These final months of innocence represented the foundation upon which everything else would be built, the deep well of love and security from which he would draw strength during his darkest moments, the clear vision of what the world could be that would sustain him through years when such possibilities seemed impossibly distant. The air nomad child who laughed as he soared through mountain air was also the future avatar who would restore balance to a broken world though the connection between these identities remained hidden beneath the surface of ordinary days filled with extraordinary joy. The morning when everything changed began like countless others before it, with prayer bells echoing across mountain peaks, and the familiar sound of young airbenders practicing their forms in temple courtyards. But beneath the surface of routine, currents of change had been building for months like storm clouds gathering beyond distant horizons. The adult monks moved with subtle tension, their conversations dropping to whispers when children approached, their eyes holding shadows that spoke of knowledge too heavy for young minds to bear. Aang noticed these changes with the peripheral awareness that children develop for adult concerns that don't directly touch their immediate world. The monks still smiled at his air scooter demonstrations, still praised his innovative techniques, still gathered around evening fires to share stories and philosophical discussions that made learning feel like play. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the Southern Air Temple, a heaviness that seemed to press down from the very air that had always felt so free and limitless. The revelation came not with dramatic announcement or solemn ceremony, but through the quiet gravity of Monk Gyatso calling him aside after morning meditation. They walked together through gardens where autumn leaves danced in currents that responded to Aang's unconscious emotional state, creating whirlwinds of gold and crimson that reflected the turbulence beginning to build within his young heart. Gyatso's usual easy humor was tempered with something deeper, more serious, as if he were preparing to share knowledge that would change everything between them forever. The toys spread before Aang in the temple's sacred chamber seemed innocuous enough. Carved animals, painted spheres, wooden puzzles that had entertained air nomad children for generations. But as Gyatso explained their true purpose, as Aang's hands moved with unconscious certainty towards specific objects that called to something deep within his spirit, the weight of cosmic responsibility began to settle around his shoulders like a cloak too heavy for someone barely 12 years old to wear with comfort. The avatar relics that Aang selected without conscious thought or deliberate choice confirmed what some of the monks had suspected since his birth, what his unprecedented mastery of airbending had suggested to those wise enough to recognize the signs. He was not simply a gifted child with unusual natural ability, not merely the youngest airbending master in recorded history, but the reincarnation of the avatar spirit itself, the bridge between worlds, the keeper of balance, the one soul in all creation charged with maintaining harmony between the four nations and the spirit realm beyond human understanding. Gyatso's explanation of avatar history and responsibility was gentle but comprehensive, delivered with the careful patience of someone who understood that childhood's end had arrived 4 years earlier than tradition dictated, that innocence was about to be replaced by knowledge too vast and terrible for any single person to bear alone. He spoke of Avatar Roku, Aang's previous incarnation, whose friendship with Fire Lord Sozin had ended in betrayal, and whose death had left the world without its spiritual guardian during the crucial years when war's seeds were planted and began to grow. The weight of this knowledge settled over Aang like physical pressure, making it difficult to breathe, impossible to think clearly about anything beyond the magnitude of what was being asked of him. To be the Avatar meant mastering all four elements, not just the air that came as naturally as breathing. It meant learning to enter the Avatar state, channeling the combined power and wisdom of all previous incarnations, while risking complete spiritual annihilation if anything went wrong. Most terrifyingly, it meant accepting responsibility for the welfare of every living being in the world, for maintaining a balance that his predecessor had somehow failed to preserve. The immediate impact of this revelation was social isolation more complete than anything Aang had previously experienced. The other children who had been his playmates and companions suddenly treated him with a mixture of awe and fear that made normal friendship impossible. Where once they had competed good-naturedly in air scooter races and sky bison polo, now they deferred to him with uncomfortable formality, as if his avatar status had transformed him into something more than human, less approachable than the boy who had shared their games and laughter just days before. The loneliness that followed was profound and disorienting, creating an emotional isolation that no amount of adult attention or spiritual instruction could completely heal. Aang found himself spending increasingly long hours in solitary practice, perfecting airbending techniques with mechanical precision, while his mind struggled to process the implications of his true identity. The joyful creativity that had once characterized his approach to bending was replaced by grim determination to master skills that suddenly felt more like burdens than gifts, tools of cosmic responsibility rather than expressions of natural harmony with his element. Monk Gyatso became his primary anchor during this period of adjustment, the one adult who seemed capable of treating him as both avatar and child, cosmic guardian and 12-year-old boy who still needed guidance, patience, and unconditional love. Their private training sessions balanced serious instruction in avatar history and philosophy, with moments of play and humor that reminded Aang that his essential nature remained unchanged, despite the weight of knowledge that now pressed upon his consciousness. Gyatso understood that preserving the child within the avatar was as crucial as developing the avatar within the child. The stories of previous avatars that Gyatso shared during their evening discussions painted a complex picture of the challenges Aang would face throughout his lifetime. Avatar Kyoshi had lived for over 2 centuries, using her immense power to maintain order through strength and decisive action that sometimes seemed harsh to those who preferred gentler approaches. Avatar Kuruk had died young, consumed by battles in the spirit world that had cost him his sanity and ultimately his life. Each tale carried lessons about the price of great power and the danger of allowing either compassion or determination to overwhelm balanced judgment. The philosophical foundations of avatar responsibility were as daunting as the technical requirements of elemental mastery. Aang learned that the avatar served not just as a bridge between the physical and spirit worlds, but as the final arbiter of disputes that could not be resolved through normal diplomatic channels. This role required wisdom that seemed impossible to develop at his age, judgment that could only come from experience he had not yet had time to accumulate, emotional stability that felt permanently shattered by the knowledge of what was expected from him. The air nomad principle of avoiding harm to all living things created particular tension with avatar duties that might require violence in defense of innocent life. Gyatso's gentle explanations of how previous avatars had navigated this contradiction provided some comfort but no clear resolution to the moral dilemmas that would inevitably arise. The taking of life, even in defense of others, violated everything Aang had been taught about spiritual development and the interconnectedness of all existence. Yet Avatar history was filled with instances when such choices had been necessary to prevent greater suffering. The growing signs of international tension that filtered through temple walls added urgency to Aang's spiritual education while heightening his anxiety about the challenges he would soon face. Reports from traveling monks spoke of increasing Fire Nation aggression, of military buildups that suggested preparation for major conflicts, of diplomatic relationships deteriorating between nations that had maintained peaceful coexistence for generations. The 100 years of peace that had followed Avatar Roku's death were clearly ending, and the responsibility for preventing or managing the coming crisis would fall to a boy who still struggled to understand the basic principles of his cosmic role. The other air nomad elders, while respectful of Gyatso's relationship with Aang and his expertise in Avatar traditions, began to express concerns about the boy's preparation for the challenges that lay ahead. They argued that his training was proceeding too slowly, that his emotional attachment to his previous life was interfering with his spiritual development, that the luxury of extended childhood was something the world could no longer afford given the growing threats to global stability. These discussions, conducted in whispers behind closed doors, nevertheless reached Aang's ears and added to his growing sense of pressure and inadequacy. The decision to accelerate his training by separating him from Gyatso represented the culmination of these concerns, a collective judgment by the Air Nomad Council that their gentler approach was insufficient for the crisis that appeared to be approaching. The Eastern Air Temple, with its emphasis on scholarly study and intensive spiritual discipline, was deemed more suitable for preparing him to master the Avatar state and develop the elemental skills he would need to fulfill his cosmic responsibilities. The separation would also remove him from the emotional attachments that the other monks believed were hindering his spiritual progress. When this decision was revealed to Aang, the world suddenly felt as if it were collapsing beneath his feet. Gyatso was not just his teacher, but the closest thing to a father he had ever known. The one person who seemed to understand the weight he carried while still believing he deserved love and acceptance regardless of his avatar status. The prospect of leaving this relationship behind, of facing his overwhelming responsibilities without the emotional anchor that had sustained him through the most difficult period of his young life, felt like a betrayal of everything the air nomads claimed to believe about compassion and understanding. The fear and confusion that overwhelmed Aang during those final days at the Southern Air Temple were complicated by guilt over his own emotional reactions. He understood intellectually that the other monks were trying to help him, that their concerns about his preparation were motivated by love for him and fear for the world's welfare. But emotionally, the decision felt like punishment for failing to develop fast enough, rejection of the child he still was, in favor of the avatar he was supposed to become, abandonment at the moment when he needed support and guidance most desperately. The conversations with Gyatso during this period revealed the old monk's own internal struggle between his personal affection for Aang and his recognition that the boy's training might indeed require approaches that felt harsh, but served necessary purposes. Gyatso's attempts to explain the council's reasoning were gentle but unconvincing, colored by his own doubts about whether separation would truly serve Aang's development better than continued nurturing of his essential humanity alongside his avatar abilities. The old monk's eyes held sadness that spoke of battles fought and lost in council chambers, of wisdom that had been overruled by fear and urgency. The weight of expectation that pressed down upon Aang during these final weeks grew heavier with each passing day. Every action was scrutinized for signs of avatar potential or worrying attachment to his previous life as an ordinary air nomad child. His emotional responses to stress were analyzed as indicators of spiritual development or evidence of immaturity that required correction. Even his relationships with Appa and the temple's other creatures were evaluated for their impact on his preparation for cosmic responsibilities that seemed to grow more daunting with each new revelation about their scope and complexity. Sleep became elusive, as Aang's mind raced through scenarios of what his life would become once he was separated from everything familiar and thrust into intensive training designed to transform him into something he wasn't sure he wanted to become. The nightmares that began to plague his rest were filled with images of himself wielding terrible power without understanding its consequences, of making decisions that affected millions of lives without having the wisdom to choose correctly, of failing in his responsibilities, and watching the world collapse into chaos because of his inadequacy. The decision to flee was not made through careful consideration of alternatives, but through the overwhelming panic of a child who saw no other way to escape pressures that threatened to crush his spirit before he had developed the strength to bear them. The plan, such as it was, involved simply flying away on Appa until he found somewhere he could exist without the weight of avatar expectations somewhere he could remain a child for whatever time remained before the world's needs made his cosmic role unavoidable. The departure from the Southern Air Temple occurred in darkness, with Aang moving through corridors and courtyards he had known since earliest childhood while trying to memorize details that he feared he might never see again. Appa responded to his emotional distress with the sensitive understanding that characterized their bond, making no sound that might alert the sleeping monks to their escape, while clearly sharing the grief and confusion that made every step away from home feel like a small death. The flight through mountain air that had always represented freedom and joy was transformed into desperate escape, with Aang pushing Appa faster and farther than their usual recreational journeys ever required. The familiar landmarks of air nomad territory fell away beneath them, replaced by unfamiliar landscapes that offered no comfort to a boy whose entire world had suddenly become threatening rather than nurturing. The adventure that should have been exciting felt instead like exile from everything that had given his life meaning and security. The storm that eventually overtook them was not the result of poor planning or navigation error, but rather the manifestation of forces beyond their control, nature itself seeming to conspire against their escape. The wind and rain that battered Appa's massive form made continued flight impossible, forcing them down toward an ocean that stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no visible shelter or hope of survival. The boy who had mastered air found himself helpless against the combination of elements that transformed sky from sanctuary into threat. The moment when their glider finally failed and they began falling toward dark waters marked the end of Aang's childhood, as surely as if a door had been slammed shut behind him forever. The terror that filled him was not just fear of death, but recognition that the life he had known, the identity he had cherished, the relationships that had sustained him were all being lost simultaneously. The avatar state that erupted from his desperate need to survive was his first experience of the cosmic power that came with his destiny, terrible and magnificent, and utterly beyond his conscious control. The sphere of ice that formed around them as they crashed into the water was both salvation and prison, preservation and transformation. The boy who entered that crystalline shell was still recognizably the child who had played air scooter games and learned philosophy from Monk Gyatso. But the forces that would eventually emerge from the iceberg would be something different. Not just Aang, but the Avatar. Changed by a century of dreams and visions, shaped by the weight of responsibility that had driven him to flee, and the power that had saved him from the consequences of that flight. The last moment of consciousness, before the ice completed its work, was filled not with regret or fear, but with a strange sense of peace that came from finally surrendering to forces beyond his understanding or control. The struggle to remain a child while accepting cosmic responsibility was over, resolved through circumstances that made choice irrelevant. Whatever emerged from the ice would be prepared by experience to face challenges that the frightened boy could never have managed, tempered by loss into someone capable of bearing burdens that had once seemed impossible to support. As sleep claimed him and the world began its century of war and suffering, Aang carried with him the love that had sustained his childhood and the wisdom that would guide his eventual return. The boy was ending, but the Avatar was being born through ice and time and the patient workings of destiny that had always known this moment would come, that had prepared him as much as anyone could be prepared for the weight of all the world's hopes and fears resting upon shoulders that would grow strong enough to bear them through the long sleep of preservation and transformation that lay ahead. The crack that split through a century of ice began as nothing more than a hairline fracture, imperceptible to any observer who might have been watching the frozen sphere that had drifted through polar waters for longer than most nations could remember their own histories. But within that crystalline prison, forces beyond normal comprehension had been stirring, responding to vibrations that traveled through water and ice from a source that would prove to be both salvation and the beginning of an adventure that would reshape the entire world. Katara's waterbending practice had become a daily ritual of frustration and determination. Each failed attempt to master techniques she had learned from stolen scrolls and half-remembered lessons, driving her to push harder against limitations that seemed insurmountable without proper instruction. The Southern Water Tribe had been stripped of its waterbending masters by Fire Nation raids that had stolen not just people but knowledge, leaving behind only fragments of a tradition that had once flowed as freely as the polar currents themselves. Her movements through the forms were awkward but earnest, powered by desperate hope that somehow she could teach herself what no one remained alive to show her. The resonance between her bending and the avatar state energy that had been building within the iceberg for decades created a sympathetic vibration that finally shattered the barriers containing forces that had been held in suspension since before her grandmother's grandmother had been born. The explosion of light and power that erupted from breaking ice was beyond anything Katara had ever witnessed, transforming her simple practice session into an encounter with legend itself, made manifest in flesh and blood and confused, frightened consciousness suddenly thrust back into a world it no longer recognized. Aang's first moments of awakening were filled with the disorientation that comes from expecting one reality and discovering another entirely. The faces that looked down at him were unfamiliar, their clothing strange, their expressions mixing wonder and fear in proportions that suggested he had become something more mythical than human during his century of sleep. The cold that bit through his robes was sharper than mountain air had ever been, carrying scents of salt and ice that spoke of vast distances from the temperate valleys where air nomads had built their temples among clouds and gentle breezes. Katara's initial reaction to the strange boy who emerged from the ice was complicated by years of stories about the avatar that had taken on the quality of fairy tales, legends so distant from practical experience that their sudden manifestation in her everyday life required complete reconstruction of everything she thought she understood about how the world worked. This boy looked nothing like the cosmic figure of legend. He was barely older than herself, confused and vulnerable, more concerned with his missing bison than with questions about his identity or the state of the world he had returned to find. The revelation of Aang's true nature came through small details rather than dramatic announcement. The blue arrows that marked him as an airbending master glowing briefly when he unconsciously entered the avatar state. The casual way he demonstrated techniques that should have been impossible for anyone but the bridge between worlds. The innocent questions about people and places that had been destroyed before Katara's grandparents were born. Each piece of evidence accumulated like snow building toward an avalanche of recognition that would change both their lives forever. Sokka's skepticism provided necessary balance to his sister's immediate acceptance of their visitor's extraordinary claims. As a warrior trained to evaluate threats and assess tactical situations, he understood that the appearance of anyone claiming to be the Avatar during a period when the Fire Nation's victory seemed inevitable was either miraculous salvation or elaborate deception designed to exploit desperate hopes. His questions were sharp and practical, focused on evidence rather than wonder, seeking proof that would justify the trust that acceptance of this boy's identity would require. The demonstration of airbending that Aang provided to convince his new companions was casual and joyful rather than awesome and terrible, showing mastery through play rather than displays of raw power that might have been more convincing, but would also have been more frightening. His air scooter carried him across snow and ice with the easy grace that spoke of lifetime familiarity with his element, while his ability to create cushions of air that could soften impacts or currents that could lift and carry objects showed the kind of practical skill that came only through years of dedicated practice. But It was Appa's emergence from beneath the snow where he had been sleeping for a century that provided the most convincing evidence of Aang's identity and the reality of their impossible situation. No ordinary person could maintain such a bond with a creature that existed only in stories and ancient texts, could communicate with a sky bison through gestures and expressions that spoke of lifetime partnership, could demonstrate the kind of mutual trust that allowed them to take flight together as naturally as walking. The sight of Appa rising into polar air was proof that legends could become flesh, that hope might still exist even in the darkest period of recorded history. The flight away from Katara and Sokka's village aboard Appa's broad back provided Aang's first comprehensive view of how completely the world had changed during his century of absence. The landscape below showed scars of war that extended far beyond any conflict he had previously witnessed. Forests burned to ash, cities abandoned or heavily fortified, whole regions apparently depopulated and left to return to wilderness. The sky itself felt different, charged with tension, and devoid of the other flying bison that should have been visible at this altitude during any normal period of air nomad history. Prince Zuko's immediate pursuit of the returned Avatar demonstrated the efficiency of Fire Nation intelligence networks and the priority that capturing Aang held in their strategic planning. The scarred prince's damaged ship represented the cutting edge of Fire Nation military technology, powered by coal and steel, rather than the wind and muscle that had moved vessels for centuries before the war began. His determination to capture the Avatar was personal as well as political, driven by desperate need to restore honor through achievement that would prove his worth to a father whose approval had been withdrawn through circumstances that Aang could not yet understand. The confrontation aboard Zuko's ship provided Aang with his first direct experience of how the war had changed, not just political relationships, but the fundamental character of human interaction between the nations. Where once travelers from different regions had met with curiosity and friendship, now every encounter was filtered through assumptions about loyalty and threat, through calculations of military advantage and strategic necessity that made genuine communication nearly impossible. Zuko saw not a child but a weapon, not a person but a symbol whose capture could transform his personal situation. Aang's escape from Fire Nation captivity relied on skills that had seemed like mere entertainment during his childhood at the Air Temple, but now proved essential for survival in a world where his very existence made him a target for forces beyond his previous imagination. The airbending techniques that had once been games became tools of evasion and defense, allowing him to move through spaces and survive impacts that would have been fatal for anyone lacking his elemental mastery and Avatar constitution. His natural creativity in applying traditional techniques to unexpected situations proved as valuable as raw power in overcoming opponents who had trained specifically to counter conventional airbending tactics. The journey toward the Northern Water Tribe began as a simple quest to find waterbending instruction for Katara, but evolved into a comprehensive education in the war's impact on every aspect of life throughout the four nations. Each village they visited told stories of loss and adaptation, of traditions abandoned or transformed by the necessities of survival, of children growing up without knowledge of peace or hope for futures that extended beyond mere continuation of existence. The scope of suffering that the war had created was beyond anything Aang had imagined possible during his sheltered childhood among the air nomads. The discovery of Monk Gyatso's remains at the Southern Air Temple provided Aang with proof of the genocide that had eliminated his people and confirmation that the childhood he remembered could never be recovered or continued. The skeleton surrounded by Fire Nation armor told a story of desperate defense and ultimate failure that broke something fundamental in Aang's understanding of how the world worked. The man who had been his father figure, teacher, and closest friend had died fighting forces that Aang might have helped resist if he had not fled in fear and confusion, rather than accepting his responsibilities. The avatar state that erupted from Aang's grief and rage during this discovery was his first conscious experience of the terrible power that came with his cosmic role. The combined fury and wisdom of all his previous incarnations channeled through emotional pain too great for any single consciousness to contain. The destruction he caused while lost in that state demonstrated both the potential for good and the danger inherent in power that operated beyond normal human control, that could reshape landscapes or obliterate cities, depending on the emotional state and moral character of whoever wielded it. Katara's ability to calm him out of the avatar state through words of comfort and understanding rather than force or manipulation revealed the importance of human connection in managing the cosmic responsibilities that threatened to overwhelm his individual identity. Her presence provided an anchor to his essential humanity, a reminder that he was still Aang beneath the weight of avatar power and expectation, still the boy who had played with lemurs and learned philosophy from a patient monk who had loved him unconditionally, despite knowing the burdens he would someday be forced to carry. The spirit world visions that began to manifest during their journey provided Aang with guidance from Avatar Roku that helped explain his role in the approaching crisis, while emphasizing the urgency of mastering skills he had barely begun to develop. Roku's warnings about Sozin's comet and its potential to end the war through Fire Nation victory carried weight that went beyond military strategy to encompass the spiritual balance of the entire world. The comet's power would enable destruction on a scale that could permanently damage the relationship between physical and spirit worlds, creating chaos that might prove impossible to restore even by future avatars. The friendship that developed between Aang, Katara, and Sokka during their travels represented more than simple companionship born of shared danger and common purpose. Their bond became the foundation for everything that would follow, providing emotional support that made their individual strengths more than the sum of their parts. Katara's compassion and determination balanced Sokka's strategic thinking and humor, while Aang's power and spiritual insight were grounded by their practical wisdom and human perspective that prevented him from losing himself entirely in cosmic responsibilities. The revelation of the war's true scope through encounters with refugees, resistance fighters, and ordinary people struggling to survive under Fire Nation occupation showed Aang that restoring balance would require more than simply defeating Fire Lord Ozai in single combat. The systems of oppression and exploitation that had developed over a century of conflict had created problems that would take generations to heal, social and economic damage that could not be repaired through displays of avatar power, but only through patient work of rebuilding trust and cooperation between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. The Northern Water Tribe's survival as the last major center of waterbending knowledge represented both hope and pressure, demonstrating that resistance was possible while emphasizing how much had already been lost to Fire Nation aggression. The tribe's defensive preparations and military organization showed how constant threat had transformed even peaceful cultures into societies focused primarily on survival rather than the growth and exploration that had characterized the world during previous periods of balance and prosperity. Master Pakku's initial refusal to train Katara in combat waterbending revealed how war and tradition could combine to create barriers that limited potential and perpetuated injustice, even among those who shared common enemies and goals. The gender restrictions that prevented women from developing their full abilities were particularly frustrating to Aang, whose air nomad upbringing had emphasized equality and individual development regardless of circumstances of birth. Katara's successful challenge to these restrictions through skill and determination demonstrated that positive change was possible even within societies that seemed rigid and unchanging. The siege of the Northern Water Tribe by Admiral Zhao's invasion fleet provided Aang with his first experience of large-scale military conflict and the terrible responsibility of using Avatar power to protect innocent lives while trying to minimize the death and destruction that seemed inevitable once violence began. The moral complexity of warfare challenged his air nomad principles about avoiding harm to all living beings, forcing him to make choices about whose lives mattered more when protecting some people required killing others. The fusion with the ocean spirit that enabled Aang to destroy most of Zhao's fleet was both triumph and terror, demonstrating the Avatar's role as bridge between worlds, while showing how easily that connection could overwhelm human consciousness and transform Protector into Destroyer. The experience of becoming something larger and more powerful than his individual self provided glimpses of the cosmic forces he was meant to channel, while warning of the dangers inherent in losing personal identity to universal principles that operated beyond normal moral constraints. The aftermath of the Northern Water Tribe's successful defense marked the end of Aang's period of initial awakening and the beginning of his journey toward full mastery of his Avatar abilities. The lessons learned during those first desperate months after emerging from the ice would shape his approach to the greater challenges that lay ahead, providing foundation in practical experience and human relationship that would prove as important as elemental mastery in the trials that awaited him. But even as celebration of their victory filled the Northern Water Tribe with hope for the future, Aang understood that this was only the beginning of a war that had already consumed too many lives and would demand much more before balance could be restored. The boy who had awakened, confused and frightened from a century of ice, had begun the transformation into the Avatar the world needed. But that transformation was far from complete, and the greatest tests of his character and abilities still lay ahead in the uncertain months before Sozin's comet would return, to determine the final outcome of humanity's long struggle between destruction and harmony. The spring that followed the siege of the Northern Water Tribe brought with it the urgency of approaching deadlines and the weight of expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Sozin's comet blazed across Aang's consciousness like a countdown to catastrophe, its promised return marking not just the end of summer but potentially the end of any hope for restored balance in a world that had known war for longer than most living people could remember. The mastery of 3 additional elements that stood between him and readiness for that final confrontation seemed impossible to achieve in the months remaining. Yet failure would mean not just personal defeat, but the permanent triumph of destruction over harmony. The journey southward from the polar regions revealed landscapes scarred by a century of conflict, forests reduced to ash, and cities abandoned to silence that spoke of suffering beyond easy comprehension. Each mile of travel brought fresh evidence of the Fire Nation's systematic campaign to eliminate not just military opposition, but the very foundations of life that made resistance possible. Rivers ran polluted with industrial waste. Farmland lay salted and barren. Entire regions showed no signs of human habitation, where thriving communities had once supported thousands of families through generations of peaceful coexistence. King Bumi's refusal to teach earthbending came as a shock that forced Aang to confront the reality that even his oldest friendships had been transformed by the war's relentless pressure. The eccentric monarch who had once delighted in games and riddles now spoke in terms of strategic patience and neutral Jing, concepts that felt like betrayal to someone desperate for immediate action and concrete progress toward goals that seemed increasingly unreachable with each delay and complication that arose to frustrate his plans. The tournament in Jiaoling represented everything that Aang had been taught to distrust about earthbending philosophy, its emphasis on aggression and dominance, seeming to contradict air nomad principles about harmony and gentle persuasion. The crowd's bloodthirsty enthusiasm for violence disguised as sport, the promoters' cynical exploitation of both fighters and spectators, the whole spectacle of people gathering to watch others inflict pain for entertainment, created an atmosphere that made Aang's skin crawl, with revulsion and doubt about whether he could ever truly master an element so fundamentally opposed to everything he valued. But the blind bandit who dominated the ring with such casual mastery revealed earthbending's deeper nature through her patient observation and precise timing, showing how apparent passivity could become devastating effectiveness when combined with perfect understanding of an opponent's weaknesses and intentions. Her ability to read the slightest vibrations through her feet transformed blindness from disability into advantage, allowing her to perceive attacks before they fully formed and respond with counterstrikes that seemed to anticipate her opponent's movements with supernatural precision. Toph's introduction to Team Avatar brought more than just earthbending instruction. She represented a completely different approach to overcoming limitations and achieving mastery through adaptation rather than compensation. Her blindness had forced her to develop senses and skills that sighted people never imagined possible, while her wealthy family's attempts to protect her from the world's dangers had only strengthened her determination to prove herself capable of anything others could achieve and more besides. The earth-bending lessons that followed challenged every assumption Aang had developed about learning and growth, forcing him to abandon the flowing grace of airbending in favor of stubborn determination and direct confrontation. Where air had taught him to yield and redirect, earth demanded that he stand firm and meet force with force, that he root himself to the ground and draw strength from immovable connection to the solid reality beneath his feet. The philosophical adjustment required was as difficult as the physical techniques, demanding transformation of his entire approach to conflict and resistance. Toph's teaching methods were as unconventional as her background, combining merciless criticism with genuine care in proportions that kept Aang constantly off balance while forcing him to develop new ways of thinking about his own capabilities and limitations. She had no patience for self-pity or excuses, no sympathy for the weight of Avatar responsibility when it interfered with practical learning, no interest in the spiritual dimensions of bending that had been central to his air nomad education. Her focus was entirely practical, results that could be measured, progress that could be demonstrated, skills that could be applied immediately to real-world challenges. The breakthrough in Aang's earthbending came not through meditation or philosophical insight, but through desperation and protective instinct when Toph's life was threatened by a Fire Nation ambush that caught them separated from their usual defensive positions. The need to protect someone else overrode his reluctance to use force directly, channeling his determination through earth that responded to emotional intensity rather than gentle persuasion. The wall that rose to shield Toph from incoming flames was crude and unstable, but it was undeniably earthbending, proof that he could master his opposite element when circumstances demanded action over contemplation. The library of Wan Shi Tong emerged from desert sands like a mirage made manifest, its impossible architecture, defying both logic and physics, in ways that reminded Aang of the spirit world's casual relationship with natural law. The ancient owl spirit who guarded this repository of human knowledge was both magnificent and terrible, possessed of wisdom accumulated over millennia, but also bitter resentment toward the species, whose conflicts had transformed learning into a tool for more efficient destruction of everything he valued about mortal civilization. The information about the solar eclipse that would render firebenders powerless represented the first real hope Aang had discovered for ending the war. Without the massive casualties that direct confrontation with Fire Nation forces would inevitably produce, the Day of Black Sun offered a window of opportunity when even Fire Lord Ozai would be vulnerable to conventional assault, when Avatar power could be decisive without requiring the terrible choices between victory and moral compromise that had haunted Aang's nightmares since learning the full scope of his responsibilities. But the price paid for this knowledge was higher than any of them had anticipated, as Wan Shi Tong's anger at their military application of his sacred texts led him to sink the library beyond mortal reach while they were still inside its shifting chambers. The escape from collapsing architecture and closing walls was harrowing enough, but the discovery that Appa had been captured during their absence created a crisis that transcended tactical concerns to strike at the emotional foundation of everything that had sustained Aang through his most difficult moments since awakening from the ice. The rage that consumed Aang when he found evidence of Appa's capture was qualitatively different from anything he had previously experienced. A fury that drew not just on his personal love for his oldest friend, but on the Avatar state's accumulated anger over injustices spanning centuries of human conflict. The destruction he wreaked upon the Sandbender tribe who had sold Appa to Fire Nation traders was terrible and precise, demonstrating power that could have reduced their entire community to constituent atoms if his friends had not intervened to prevent complete loss of control. Katara's ability to calm him from the Avatar state through understanding rather than force had become one of the most crucial elements in preventing Aang's cosmic responsibilities from overwhelming his individual identity and Krucha, moral center. Her presence provided an anchor to his essential humanity that no amount of spiritual training or philosophical instruction could replace, reminding him that he was still the boy who had played with lemurs and learned kindness from Monk Gyatso despite the terrible power that sometimes threatened to consume everything gentle and compassionate about his nature. The infiltration of Ba Sing Se revealed corruption and complacency that had transformed the Earth Kingdom's greatest stronghold into a monument to willful ignorance and systemic dysfunction. The Daili's control over information and the Earth King's complete disconnection from the reality of his realm's situation showed how peace could become stagnation when maintained through deliberate blindness to problems that required active engagement and difficult decisions to resolve effectively. Long Feng's conspiracy to maintain Ba Sing Se's artificial peace by suppressing all knowledge of the war represented the ultimate corruption of earthbending philosophy, using stubborn immobility to preserve a status quo that served only the interests of those who benefited from existing power structures, while leaving everyone else vulnerable to forces they were not allowed to acknowledge or prepare to face. The underground prison where dissidents disappeared, and the careful control of information that prevented even the Earth King from understanding his kingdom's true situation, demonstrated how the desire for stability could become a tool of oppression as effective as any weapon. The rescue of Appa from the Daili's secret facilities provided Aang with his first successful infiltration mission, testing skills in stealth and non-violent problem-solving that had been theoretical during his Air Temple education, but now proved essential for operating in a world where direct confrontation often created more problems than it solved. The reunion with his oldest friend was emotional catharsis that reminded him of connections that transcended the Avatar's cosmic role, relationships that existed independently of his spiritual responsibilities and provided meaning that had nothing to do with saving the world. Guru Pathik's teaching about the chakras and the Avatar state offered systematic approach to spiritual development that complemented but also challenged the more intuitive methods Aang had learned from the air nomads. The chakra system provided a framework for understanding how emotional attachments and psychological blocks could interfere with spiritual growth, while also suggesting that complete detachment might be necessary for achieving the level of avatar mastery that the approaching crisis would require from him. The conflict between spiritual development and human attachment that emerged during these lessons struck at the heart of Aang's identity as both avatar and individual person. Guru Pathik's insistence that earthly attachments must be released to unlock the avatar state's full potential contradicted everything Aang believed about the importance of love and connection in maintaining the moral center that prevented cosmic power from becoming destructive force, rather than healing influence on the world. The choice between mastering the avatar state and maintaining his emotional bond with Katara was presented as absolute and irrevocable, forcing Aang to decide whether his effectiveness as the avatar was more important than his humanity as an individual who needed love and friendship to remain psychologically stable and morally grounded. The decision to abandon the final chakra in order to rescue Katara from the vision of danger that interrupted his spiritual training was instinctive rather than calculated, emotional rather than strategic. The confrontation in Ba Sing Se's crystal catacombs brought together all the major conflicts and relationships that had been building throughout Aang's earthbending journey, creating a crucible where personal loyalty, political necessity, and cosmic responsibility collided in ways that would reshape everyone involved. Zuko's presence as both potential ally and confirmed enemy added moral complexity that made simple solutions impossible, while Azula's calculating cruelty demonstrated how intelligence and skill could be perverted into tools for causing maximum suffering to the greatest number of people. The moment when Aang successfully entered the avatar state through emotional rather than spiritual means represented both triumph and tragedy, showing that love could be as effective as detachment in accessing cosmic power, while setting up the devastating vulnerability that Azula's lightning would exploit with surgical precision. The attack came at the exact moment when victory seemed assured, when the avatar state's full power was flowing through Aang's consciousness without the barriers that might have provided some protection against unexpected assault. The lightning bolt that struck Aang while he was fully merged with the avatar state created damage that went beyond physical injury to threaten the fundamental continuity of the avatar cycle itself. The seventh chakra that had been opening to grant complete access to his cosmic role was traumatically sealed, while the avatar spirit's connection to the mortal world was severed in ways that might prove permanent if the proper healing could not be provided quickly enough to prevent irreversible spiritual damage. Katara's use of spirit water from the North Pole to revive Aang represented both miraculous salvation and profound sacrifice, as the sacred liquid that might have served other crucial purposes was instead devoted to healing wounds that conventional medicine could never address. The revival that followed was incomplete, leaving Aang alive but fundamentally changed, cut off from the avatar state that had been his primary source of power, while facing challenges that would require every resource he could possibly summon to overcome successfully. The underground journey out of Ba Sing Se in the company of Iroh, whose unexpected assistance complicated every assumption they had made about Fire Nation loyalty and motivation, provided time for reflection on how completely their situation had been transformed by the events in the Crystal Catacombs. Ba Sing Se had fallen despite their efforts. The Earth Kingdom's organized resistance was broken, and the approaching eclipse that had seemed like salvation now felt like a deadline that they were unlikely to meet with adequate preparation. The physical and spiritual injuries that Aang carried away from Ba Sing Se would influence everything that followed, creating limitations that forced him to develop new strategies, while serving as constant reminders of the costs that came with avatar responsibility and the price of making choices based on emotion rather than strategic calculation. The scar that marked where Azula's lightning had struck would never fully fade, serving as permanent evidence of vulnerability that cosmic power could not eliminate, and wisdom that could only be gained through surviving experiences that tested every aspect of character and commitment to principles that seemed increasingly difficult to maintain in a world that rewarded cruelty over compassion. As they emerged from the underground passages into sunlight that felt alien after the darkness of defeat and near death, Aang understood that his education in earthbending had encompassed far more than elemental technique or combat application. He had learned about standing firm in the face of overwhelming opposition, about the importance of solid foundations for any structure intended to last, about the way that apparent defeat could become the basis for eventual victory if the lessons embedded in failure were properly understood and applied to future challenges. The earth-bending master he had become bore little resemblance to the frightened boy who had struggled to move his first pebble through stubborn determination rather than flowing grace. The element that had seemed most foreign to his air-nomad nature had taught him about strength that came not from avoiding conflict but from meeting it directly, about power that drew from connection to fundamental realities rather than dancing around their edges, about the difference between yielding wisely and surrendering completely to forces that could be resisted through proper technique and sufficient courage. But the greatest lesson that Earth had taught him was about the cost of protecting others and the weight of decisions that affected not just individual lives, but the fate of entire civilizations. The avatar who emerged from Ba Sing Se was no longer the child who had awakened from ice with innocence intact. But neither was he the broken figure that failure and injury might have created under different circumstances. He was something new, tested but not defeated, wounded but not destroyed, changed by experience, into someone capable of bearing burdens that would have crushed the boy who had first tried to move stones through gentle persuasion and wishful thinking. The ship that carried them through Fire Nation waters moved through liquid darkness like a ghost vessel from some fever dream, its hull painted in enemy colors, while sheltering the very people that every patrol and garrison had been ordered to capture or destroy. The irony was not lost on Aang as he lay in the cabin below decks, his body slowly healing from injuries that had nearly severed the Avatar cycle forever, while his mind grappled with the reality that they were now fugitives in the heart of the nation that had declared war on everything he represented. The weeks of unconsciousness that followed Azula's lightning had been filled with journeys through the spirit world that Aang could only partially remember upon waking. Fragments of conversations with previous incarnations who had tried to prepare him for the trials that lay ahead while his physical form hovered between life and death. Avatar Roku's presence had been strongest during these visions, the previous incarnation's regret over his failure to prevent the war, adding weight to warnings about the approaching comet and the narrow window of opportunity that remained for preventing Fire Nation victory. The hair that had grown during his recovery felt strange beneath his fingers, a physical reminder that time was passing while his ability to access the Avatar state remained frustratingly elusive. Each attempt to enter that cosmic consciousness met with barriers that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as his body healed, leaving him dependent on his individual skills, at a time when the challenges ahead would require power beyond any single person's capacity to provide. The scar on his back throbbed with each failed effort, as if Azula's lightning had left behind more than physical damage. The Fire Nation itself proved to be a revelation that challenged every assumption Aang had developed about the enemy during his journey through the other nations. The people they encountered in villages and towns showed the same capacity for kindness and suffering that he had observed everywhere else, their lives shaped by the war, in ways that made simple categorizations of good and evil impossible to maintain. Children played in streets that could have been transplanted from the Earth Kingdom or Water Tribes, while their parents worked and worried and loved with the same fundamental humanity that war's propaganda tried so hard to deny or diminish. The puppet show they attended in a small coastal town presented Fire Nation history in terms that revealed how thoroughly the government's version of events had penetrated even entertainment designed for children. The Avatar was portrayed as a monster whose return threatened Fire Nation prosperity and security, while Fire Lord Ozai appeared as a benevolent leader, protecting his people from dangers they were too innocent to understand. The audience's enthusiastic response to these distortions was more disturbing than outright hostility would have been, showing how completely truth could be buried beneath layers of carefully constructed narrative. The assassin who pursued them through Fire Nation territory was unlike any opponent they had previously faced, his combustion bending, creating explosions from pure thought that turned the landscape itself into a weapon against them. Combustion Man's relentless pursuit demonstrated that even in their enemy's heartland, they could find no true safety, that forces beyond conventional military organization were dedicated to preventing their interference with plans that had been decades in the making. Each attack came without warning, transforming peaceful moments into desperate flights for survival that reminded them how thoroughly they were outmatched by resources arrayed against their mission. The day of the eclipse arrived with all the anticipation and dread of a long-awaited execution, carrying hopes that had sustained the invasion planning for months, while also marking the last clear opportunity to end the war before Sozin's comet would tip the balance permanently toward Fire Nation victory. Aang's role in the assault was supposed to be decisive. Find Fire Lord Ozai, while his firebending was neutralized, and end the conflict through single combat that would spare both sides the massive casualties that prolonged fighting would inevitably produce. The bunker beneath the Fire Nation capital was a maze of tunnels and chambers designed to protect the royal family during exactly this kind of attack, its passages filled with traps and dead ends that wasted precious minutes while the eclipse's duration ticked away toward its inevitable conclusion. Each wrong turn felt like personal failure as Aang raced through corridors that seemed to shift and multiply, seeking an opponent who had clearly prepared for this possibility with the same thoroughness that characterized all Fire Nation military planning. Azula's deception about Ozai's location was masterly in its simplicity, drawing the invasion's leadership into confrontation with someone who could neither be defeated nor extracted as a prisoner, while the real Fire Lord remained safely hidden until his power returned with the sun's restoration. The princess's casual cruelty in revealing the truth only after the eclipse had ended demonstrated the depth of planning that had gone into turning their greatest hope into an elaborate trap that left them more vulnerable than before the place. Assault began. The retreat from the Fire Nation capital was chaos, barely controlled by desperate leadership and individual heroism that could not compensate for the fundamental failure of their strategic premise. The earthbenders and waterbenders who had risked everything on the promise that the eclipse would level the playing field found themselves facing renewed firebending, with their formations broken and their morale shattered by realization that their enemy had been prepared for every aspect of their ruse. Assault from the moment planning began. Aang's decision to remain behind while the invasion force retreated was driven by understanding that the adult conspirators faced capture and execution, while the younger members of their group might still have opportunities to continue resistance through methods that required different skills and approaches. The Western Air Temple offered sanctuary that was both strategic and symbolic, its upside-down architecture reflecting how completely their situation had been inverted by the eclipse's failure to provide the victory that everyone had expected. The arrival of Zuko at the temple was greeted with suspicion that bordered on hostility, his previous betrayals and attacks making trust seem impossible, despite his apparent sincerity in offering to teach Aang firebending. The prince's transformation from enemy to potential ally required evidence more convincing than words, proof that his change of heart was genuine rather than elaborate deception designed to complete Azula's work through different means. The group's rejection of his initial overtures was unanimous and immediate, their experiences with Fire Nation duplicity making acceptance of his offer feel like suicidal naivety. But the defeat of Combustion Man through Zuko's intervention provided exactly the kind of proof that words alone could never supply, demonstrating commitment that went beyond mere convenience to encompass genuine sacrifice of his standing with the Fire Nation in favor of protecting the people he claimed to want to help. The prince's knowledge of the assassin's techniques and willingness to use that knowledge against his former allies showed that his defection was complete and irreversible, that whatever consequences followed from his choice to join Team Avatar would be permanent rather than temporary. The firebending instruction that followed challenged every preconception Aang had developed about fire as an element of destruction and aggression, revealing instead the creative and life-giving aspects that had been perverted by a century of military application. Zuko's teaching methods were shaped by his own journey from privileged prince to scarred exile to repentant student, emphasizing the emotional and spiritual foundations that made bending more than mere technique, while acknowledging the practical requirements that battlefield application would demand. The loss of Zuko's firebending abilities following his decision to abandon his former allegiances created a teaching crisis that threatened to derail Aang's progress just when time was becoming most critical. The prince's flames had grown weak and inconsistent since his confrontation with Ozai, his internal transformation apparently disrupting the anger and hatred that had previously fueled his bending, while new emotional foundations remained insufficiently developed to support his elemental mastery. The irony of a firebending teacher who could barely produce sparks was a bitter reminder of how completely their situation had deteriorated. The journey to find the Sun Warriors was motivated by desperation as much as curiosity, seeking answers to questions about firebending's true nature that conventional Fire Nation education had never addressed. The ancient civilization that had mastered fire before it became a tool of conquest offered perspectives that predated the war and the philosophy that had made such comprehensive destruction possible. Their survival in hidden cities suggested that alternatives to Fire Nation ideology had been preserved despite centuries of systematic effort to eliminate or suppress competing approaches to elemental mastery. The trial by the original dragons was the most terrifying experience of Aang's educational journey, facing judges whose power and wisdom dwarfed anything he had previously encountered, while knowing that failure would mean death for both teacher and student. Ran and Shaw's evaluation went beyond technical skill to encompass spiritual worthiness, their ancient eyes seeing through to motivations and character traits that could not be hidden or misrepresented through clever performance or tactical deception. The rainbow flames that the dragons produced in response to their demonstration were unlike any fire Aang had ever seen, containing colors and energies that spoke of life and creation rather than destruction and consumption. The warmth that emanated from these flames was healing rather than harmful, nurturing rather than threatening, showing that fire's essential nature was growth and renewal, rather than the devastation that Fire Nation military doctrine had emphasized for generations. This revelation transformed Aang's understanding of his most challenging element while providing Zuko with the spiritual foundation he needed to restore his own abilities. The knowledge that fire was the element of life rather than death created new possibilities for how Aang might approach his eventual confrontation with Fire Lord Ozai, suggesting that victory might be achieved through demonstration of fire's true nature rather than through superior destructive capability. The dragon's lesson about the first firebenders being dragons and the way they shared their knowledge with humans provided a model for teaching and learning that emphasized partnership rather than domination, cooperation rather than conquest. Zuko's restoration of his firebending abilities through this new understanding marked a turning point in their relationship as teacher and student, creating bonds of mutual respect and shared discovery that went beyond the practical necessities of their situation. The prince's joy at producing flames that were strong and controlled but also beautiful and warm was infectious, reminding everyone present that mastery should bring happiness rather than merely effectiveness in combat applications. The attack on the Western Air Temple by Azula's forces was swift and comprehensive, demonstrating that their location was no longer secret and that the princess had developed countermeasures for the temple's defensive advantages. The airship assault that forced them to evacuate showed how quickly Fire Nation technology could adapt to overcome natural barriers that had protected the air nomads for centuries. While the precision of the attack suggested intelligence about their capabilities and limitations that could only have come from careful observation over extended periods. The escape from the collapsing temple required every skill they had developed individually and collectively, their coordination under pressure, showing how much they had grown as a team while the desperate circumstances reminded them how precarious their situation remained. Appa's strength in carrying everyone to safety was matched by each person's contribution to protecting others, creating moments of heroism that emerged naturally from their shared commitment to survival and mutual support. The revelation of Fire Lord Ozai's plan to use Sozin's comet to burn the entire Earth Kingdom created urgency that went beyond personal survival, to encompass the fate of everyone who lived in regions that Fire Nation forces could reach. The scope of destruction that the enhanced firebending would make possible exceeded anything that had occurred during the previous century of war, promising genocide on a scale that would make the elimination of the air nomads seem like a minor skirmish in comparison. The moral crisis that this knowledge created for Aang was more profound than any previous challenge to his principles, forcing him to confront the possibility that his air nomad commitment to preserving all life might be incompatible with preventing suffering on the massive scale that Ozai's plan would create. The traditional Avatar approach of stopping tyrants through lethal force offered clear solutions that Aang's personal philosophy made impossible to accept, while alternative approaches seemed inadequate for dealing with threats of such magnitude and immediacy. The pressure from his friends to abandon his principles in favor of practical necessity was well-intentioned but deeply troubling, showing how even those closest to him could not fully understand the spiritual dimensions of his dilemma. Their arguments were logical and compelling from tactical perspectives, but they failed to address the fundamental question of whether saving the world would be meaningful if the process required him to become the kind of person who could kill without spiritual consequences that would undermine everything the Avatar was supposed to represent. The lion turtle's appearance was so unexpected and overwhelming that Aang initially wondered if he was experiencing hallucinations brought on by stress and exhaustion. The ancient creature's size dwarfed anything he had previously encountered, its presence carrying spiritual weight that made communication feel more like divine revelation than normal conversation. The being's age and wisdom were evident in every word, suggesting knowledge that predated not just the current war but human civilization itself. The lesson about energy bending that the lion turtle provided offered exactly the solution that Aang's moral dilemma required, while introducing possibilities that went beyond anything he had imagined might be achievable. The ability to remove someone's bending rather than ending their life represented the perfect synthesis of mercy and justice, a way of stopping Ozai permanently, without compromising the spiritual principles that made victory meaningful, rather than merely tactical. But the warning that came with this knowledge was sobering, emphasizing that energy bending required absolute moral purity and unshakable spiritual foundation to avoid corruption by the very power it was meant to control. The lion turtle's caution about the technique's dangers reminded Aang that even the most promising solutions carried risks that could transform salvation into damnation. If the person wielding such power lacked sufficient wisdom and character to handle its temptations, the final preparation for confronting Fire Lord Ozai was both physical and spiritual, combining combat training with meditation that would hopefully provide the inner strength necessary to survive what promised to be the most challenging experience of Aang's entire existence. The energy-bending technique required not just skill, but perfect confidence in his own moral authority, absolute certainty that his cause was just and his methods were worthy of the power he would be wielding on behalf of everyone who would be affected by the outcome. As Sozin's comet began to appear in the sky above the Fire Nation, growing brighter and more ominous with each passing hour, Aang felt the weight of preparation and anticipation building toward the moment when everything he had learned and everyone he had become would be tested in a confrontation that would determine not just the war's outcome but the kind of world that would emerge from whatever remained when the fighting finally ended. The boy who had once fled from responsibility in terror and confusion had been transformed by experience into someone capable of facing the ultimate test of avatar power and wisdom, but the transformation had come at costs that would never be fully calculated. The gentle child who had played with lemurs and learned kindness from Monk Gyatso remained at the core of his identity, but that innocence was now tempered by knowledge of evil's reality and power's burden that would influence every decision he made for the rest of his extraordinary life. The island that emerged from mist-shrouded waters near Ember Island seemed to materialize from the boundary between waking and dreaming, its shores composed of crystalline sand that sparkled with inner light and vegetation that swayed without wind to disturb its perfect stillness. Aang's desperate flight from his friend's well-intentioned pressure had carried him beyond the familiar geography of maps and navigation into waters where compass directions held no meaning and time itself seemed to flow according to different principles than those governing the ordinary world. The creature that revealed itself as his footsteps disturbed the otherworldly silence was beyond anything recorded in the most comprehensive bestiary or spiritual text. Its shell forming landscapes that could have contained entire cities, while its ancient eyes held wisdom accumulated across eons that predated human civilization by millennia uncounted. The lion turtle's voice resonated through Aang's consciousness rather than his ears, carrying concepts and emotions that normal language could never encompass, while speaking truths that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely to lodge themselves directly in the deepest chambers of his spiritual understanding. The revelation that energy bending was the first of all bending arts, the original manipulation of life force itself from which the four elemental disciplines had eventually emerged, transformed every assumption Aang had developed about the nature of avatar power and the relationship between spiritual energy and physical manifestation. This ancient technique required not just mastery of external forces, but absolute dominion over one's own internal spiritual state, perfect alignment between conscious intention and unconscious motivation that would make any deception or self-delusion immediately fatal to the practitioner. The warning that accompanied this knowledge was delivered with the grave solemnity of someone who had witnessed the consequences of energy bending misused, who understood that the power to directly manipulate another being's spiritual essence was perhaps the most dangerous ability that consciousness could wield. The lion turtle's caution about requiring unbendable spirit to avoid corruption by the very energy being manipulated spoke of trials where even well-intentioned practitioners had been consumed by forces they thought they could control, transformed into the very evil they had sought to eliminate. But alongside these warnings came hope more profound than anything Aang had dared to imagine during his struggles with the moral implications of his approaching confrontation with Fire Lord Ozai. The possibility of permanently ending the threat posed by the Phoenix King without destroying the essential humanity that made redemption theoretically possible offered exactly the synthesis of justice and mercy that his heir nomad, Principe demanded, the solution that would allow victory without spiritual compromise, that could undermine everything the Avatar was supposed to represent. The instruction in energy bending that followed was unlike any teaching Aang had previously received, requiring him to reach into aspects of his consciousness that existed beyond normal. Waking awareness, while maintaining the kind of moral certainty that doubt or fear could instantly shatter. The technique demanded perfect confidence in his own spiritual authority, combined with absolute humility before the cosmic forces he would be channeling, a paradoxical state of mind that few practitioners in history had been able to achieve and sustain under the pressures of actual application. The practice sessions that prepared him for using energy bending in combat were conducted in meditation deeper than any he had previously experienced, his consciousness traveling to realms where the boundaries between self and universe became meaningless, while his physical form remained anchored to the lion turtle's shell through connection to life forces that flowed through all existence. These journeys provided glimpses of the cosmic perspective that Avatar power was meant to channel, showing him how individual actions rippled through the fabric of reality to influence outcomes far beyond their immediate apparent effects. The return journey to rejoin his friends was accomplished in consciousness rather than physical travel. The lion turtle's ancient wisdom, transporting him across impossible distances through manipulation of space and time, that made conventional movement seem crude and inefficient by comparison. The experience of arriving at his destination without experiencing the journey itself was disorienting, but also profoundly educational, demonstrating how thoroughly his understanding of reality's fundamental nature had been expanded by exposure to knowledge that predated all recorded history. The reunion with Team Avatar on the morning of Sozin's comet's arrival was complicated by their mixture of relief at his return and confusion about where he had been during the crucial hours when final preparations should have been consuming all his attention. His attempts to explain the lion turtle and the knowledge gained from their encounter were met with skepticism that reflected how completely the experience transcended normal categories of possibility, how difficult it was to communicate spiritual truths that could only be fully understood through direct experience of the consciousness states they required. The comet itself blazed across the dawn sky like a wound torn in the fabric of heaven, its crimson light casting everything in shades of blood and fire that seemed to prophesy the destruction that Fire Lord Ozai intended to unleash upon the world. The enhanced firebending that its presence made possible was already evident in the more intense flames that ordinary Fire Nation soldiers could produce, their attacks carrying power that exceeded anything they had demonstrated during previous encounters, their destructive potential multiplied to levels that conventional defenses would be inadequate to counter. The airship fleet that rose from Fire Nation bases to carry out Ozai's final solution was a sight of terrible magnificence, their numbers darkening the sky, while their payloads promised devastation that would make the previous century of war seem like a mere prelude to the real carnage that industrial-scale genocide could accomplish when enhanced by cosmic forces. Each vessel represented hundreds of lives that would be lost if the attack proceeded as planned, while their collective mission threatened to end civilization itself in regions that Fire Nation flames could reach. The approach to Ozai's flagship was accomplished through airbending techniques that pushed Aang's abilities beyond their previous limits, the comet's energy affecting even his own element in ways that allowed maneuvers and speeds that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The enhanced avatar state that he could access while the celestial body blazed overhead provided power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Cosmic forces flowing through his consciousness with intensity that threatened to overwhelm his individual identity while offering capabilities that seemed almost unlimited in their potential scope. The confrontation with Fire Lord Ozai began with words rather than violence. Aang's final attempt to resolve their conflict through communication and reason rather than the decisive combat that everyone else expected would be necessary. The Phoenix King's response revealed the depth of his commitment to destruction as an end in itself rather than a means to achieve specific political objectives. His vision of purification through fire, showing how completely power had corrupted his understanding of leadership and responsibility to the people he claimed to serve. The battle that erupted across the landscape of Wulong Forest was unlike anything in recorded Avatar history. The enhanced abilities that both combatants could access under the comet's influence, creating destruction on a scale that reshaped geography, while demonstrating just how catastrophic the Avatar's full power could be when directed against an opponent of comparable abilities. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash in moments, while rock formations that had endured millennia cracked and crumbled under forces that seemed capable of unmaking the world itself. Ozai's firebending had been transformed by the comet into something approaching a force of nature, his flames hot enough to melt stone and extensive enough to consume entire forests, while his mobility allowed him to strike from any direction with speed that made conventional evasion nearly impossible. The Phoenix King's tactical intelligence remained sharp despite his moral corruption, his attacks designed not just to cause immediate damage, but to drive Aang into positions where his air nomad reluctance to cause harm would become a decisive disadvantage in prolonged combat. The moment when Aang's back struck the jutting rock that had been created during their battle was simultaneously accident and destiny. The random chance of combat positioning, combining with the precise pressure needed to unlock the chakra that Azula's lightning had sealed months earlier. The pain that shot through his nervous system was excruciating but also liberating, breaking barriers that had kept him separated from the Avatar state's full power, while the comet blazed overhead to provide enhancement beyond anything he had previously been able to access. The Avatar state that erupted from this physical trauma was more complete than any previous manifestation, channeling not just the knowledge and abilities of past incarnations, but their accumulated determination to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic destruction that Ozai represented. The combined will of every Avatar who had ever lived flowed through Aang's consciousness, their voices speaking in harmony about the necessity of stopping this threat regardless of the personal cost that such action might require from the current incarnation of their eternal spirit. The reversal of fortune that followed was swift and comprehensive, Ozai's enhanced abilities proving inadequate against Avatar power that drew on cosmic forces the comet could amplify but not match. The Fire Lord, who had seemed invincible moments before, was suddenly helpless against attacks that came from every element simultaneously, his defensive capabilities overwhelmed by coordination and intensity that no single bender could hope to counter through individual skill or tactical planning. Regardless of enhancement their power might have received from celestial influence. But the moment of ultimate choice arrived, not with Ozai defeated, but with him helpless, his life forfeit according to every precedent established by previous avatars when dealing with threats of comparable magnitude and malevolence. The voices of past incarnations spoke with unanimity about the necessity of ending the Phoenix King's existence permanently, their collective wisdom insisting that anything less than death would be inadequate to prevent future iterations of the same destructive ambitions that had already cost so many lives and threatened so many more. The internal struggle that followed was more intense than any external battle Aang had ever fought. His individual consciousness wrestling with the combined will of every previous avatar, while cosmic power flowed through his being at levels that made maintaining personal identity increasingly difficult. The temptation to simply surrender to that accumulated wisdom and allow his predecessor's judgment to guide his actions was overwhelming, offering escape from moral responsibility through submission to authority that seemed infinitely wiser than his own young understanding. Avatar Kyoshi's voice was strongest among those counseling decisive action, her centuries of experience dealing with threats to world peace, providing arguments that were both logical and compelling about the necessity of permanent solutions to permanent problems. Her reminder that justice sometimes required actions that individual conscience found distasteful was supported by historical examples of mercy that had enabled greater suffering than immediate harshness would have caused. Precedents that suggested Aang's reluctance to kill might be naive rather than virtuous. Avatar Roku's presence carried additional weight due to his direct connection to the current crisis, his previous failure to stop Fire Lord Sozin having created the conditions that made Ozai's rise to power possible, while his death had left the world without Avatar protection during the crucial years when the war's foundations were being established. His counsel to end the cycle of violence through decisive action was colored by personal guilt over opportunities missed and relationships trusted beyond their capacity to bear the weight of such faith. But even as these voices pressed for action that would resolve the crisis permanently, Aang remained aware of the lion turtle's teaching about energy bending and the possibility it represented for achieving justice without compromising the spiritual principles that made victory meaningful rather than merely tactical. The technique required perfect certainty about his own moral authority, absolute confidence that his spiritual state was pure enough to manipulate Ozai's life force, without being corrupted by the process of exercising such intimate power over another consciousness. The decision to attempt energy bending rather than simple execution was made in an instant of clarity that cut through all arguments and authorities to reach the essential truth of what the Avatar was supposed to represent. The bridge between worlds could not maintain that function if the process of protecting one realm required abandoning the values that made it worth protecting, could not preserve balance, if achieving victory required becoming the kind of person who could destroy life as easily as preserving it. The application of energy bending to Fire Lord Ozai was the most challenging technique Aang had ever attempted, requiring him to reach into the Phoenix King's spiritual essence while maintaining perfect separation between their consciousness, to avoid contamination by the hatred and cruelty that had shaped his opponent's character across decades of unopposed power. The process felt like reaching into fire that burned not flesh but spirit, exposure to malevolence that threatened to transform him into a reflection of everything he sought to eliminate from the world. The resistance that Ozai's spirit offered was formidable and multifaceted, his will to dominate others, having been refined into something approaching a force of nature through years of successfully imposing his desires on everyone around him without meaningful opposition. The Phoenix King's sense of absolute entitlement to power over others created barriers that had to be overcome, not through superior force, but through moral certainty that could not be shaken by exposure to evil's arguments about the necessity and inevitability of corruption. But gradually, steadily, the energy bending began to take effect as Aang's spiritual purity proved stronger than Ozai's accumulated malice, his commitment to preserving life more powerful than his opponent's dedication to destroying it. The Fire Lord's bending was not simply suppressed but fundamentally severed. The connection between his consciousness and the spiritual forces that enabled elemental manipulation permanently broken in ways that no amount of training or meditation could ever restore. The moment when the process was complete was marked by silence more profound than anything Aang had ever experienced. The absence of cosmic forces that had been flowing through both combatants, creating emptiness that seemed to stretch across the entire battlefield. Ozai's collapse was not dramatic, but rather pathetic. The man who had styled himself Phoenix King, revealed as merely another human being whose power had come from sources external to his essential character, rather than from virtues that could survive the loss of abilities that had never truly belonged to him. The victory that followed was complete, but strangely hollow, achieved through methods that satisfied Aang's moral principles while leaving him emotionally exhausted by the spiritual effort required to maintain those standards under circumstances that would have justified abandoning them. The technique that had seemed like perfect synthesis of justice and mercy had proven to be perhaps more demanding than simple execution would have been, requiring resources that conventional combat could never touch or threaten. The aftermath of Ozai's defeat brought not celebration, but quiet contemplation of costs that went beyond anything visible in the immediate destruction surrounding them. The avatar state that had enabled victory began to fade as the comet passed beyond the range where its enhancement could be sustained, leaving Aang feeling diminished and strangely vulnerable after experiencing power that had seemed unlimited in its scope and intensity. The reunion with his friends who had been fighting their own battles across the Fire Nation brought relief, mixed with recognition that their individual struggles had been part of a larger pattern of transformation that would reshape not just political relationships, but the fundamental nature of how the four nations understood their connections to each other and the world they shared. The war's end was not conclusion but beginning, the start of reconstruction that would prove as challenging as the conflict that had preceded it. Zuko's assumption of leadership as Fire Lord represented hope that the damage caused by his father and grandfather might eventually be repaired through patient work of rebuilding trust and cooperation between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies for longer than anyone living could remember. The new Fire Lord's commitment to making amends for his nation's crimes would require generations to accomplish completely, but the foundation for that work had been laid through choices made in the moment when victory could have meant vengeance rather than restoration. The kiss with Katara that sealed their romantic relationship was sweet and tentative, carrying promise of happiness that had seemed impossible during the dark years when survival had consumed all their energy and attention. The love that had grown between them through shared danger and mutual support offered foundation for building lives that encompassed more than duty and responsibility, futures that included personal joy alongside the cosmic obligations that would always be part of Aang's existence as the Avatar. As celebrations began across the four nations and news of the war's end spread to regions that had known nothing but conflict for longer than most inhabitants could remember, Aang found himself contemplating not what had been accomplished, but what lay ahead in a world where peace would have to be built from the ruins of everything that war had destroyed or corrupted. The Avatar who had emerged from final battle was no longer the frightened child who had awakened from ice, but neither was he the cosmic figure that others might expect would be capable of solving every problem that reconstruction would inevitably create. The boy who had once run away from responsibility had become someone who understood that true strength lay not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to preserve what was worth saving, while having the courage to change what could not be allowed to continue. The gentle spirit that had learned kindness from Monk Yatso remained at the core of his identity, but it was now tempered by knowledge of evil's reality and equipped with abilities that could protect innocence without compromising the values that made protection meaningful rather than merely tactical. The peace that settled over the four nations in the aftermath of Fire Lord Ozai's defeat was fragile and complex, carrying within it seeds of both hope and discord that would test every lesson Aang had learned during his journey from frightened child to Avatar Master. The celebrations that erupted in cities and villages across the world were genuine expressions of joy at war's end. But beneath the surface lay questions about how peoples who had been enemies for a century could learn to coexist as neighbors, how institutions built for conflict could be transformed to serve cooperation, how individuals shaped by loss could find the courage to trust again. The Fire Nation colonies that dotted Earth Kingdom territory had become more than military outposts during their decades of existence, evolving into communities where Fire Nation settlers had built lives, raised families, and developed deep connections to lands they now considered home, despite the circumstances of their arrival. These settlements represented the war's most complex legacy, embodying both the aggression that had created them and the human relationships that had grown within their borders. Across generations of shared experience and gradual integration with local populations, Yudao stood as the oldest and largest of these colonial settlements, its streets a living testament to how cultures could blend and evolve when political boundaries proved less important than practical necessity and personal affection. Fire Nation architecture had been modified to accommodate Earth Kingdom materials and climate, while local customs had been adopted and adapted by immigrants whose children knew no other home than the one their parents had helped build through decades of patient labor and community development. The harmony restoration movement that emerged from initial post-war planning sessions seemed logical and necessary to leaders who viewed the colonies as symbols of Fire Nation aggression that needed to be erased to restore proper boundaries between nations. Earth King Kuei's enthusiasm for removing all Fire Nation presence from his territory was matched by many Fire Nation officials, who saw repatriation as the cleanest solution to questions about loyalty and citizenship that colonial populations raised through their very existence. But Aang's first visit to Yudao revealed complexities that simple political solutions could not address without creating new forms of suffering to replace those that war had ended. The mixed families he encountered challenged every assumption about cultural separation. Children whose heritage encompassed both Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom traditions, while their identities had been shaped by colonial experiences that belonged fully to neither parent culture nor any recognized political category. The conversation with Kori, the daughter of a Fire Nation colonist and Earth Kingdom woman, provided Aang with perspectives on identity and belonging that his air nomad upbringing had not prepared him to understand. Her family's story revealed how love could transcend political boundaries while creating vulnerabilities that policy decisions made by distant authorities could destroy without consideration for human costs that statistics could never capture adequately. The moral complexity of the colonial situation was compounded by evidence that many Fire Nation settlers had genuinely integrated into local communities, contributing skills and labor that had improved conditions for everyone, while developing relationships that went beyond mere economic convenience to encompass friendship, intermarriage, and shared investment in futures that included both cultural traditions. The idea of forcibly removing these people felt increasingly similar to the displacements and separations that had characterized the war itself. Zuko's growing opposition to wholesale decolonization reflected his direct exposure to colonial communities and his recognition that justice sometimes required nuanced responses rather than simple reversal of previous policies. The young Fire Lord's change of heart about the harmony restoration movement created tensions with Aang that tested their friendship, while forcing both to confront how their different responsibilities and perspectives could lead to conflicting conclusions about what peace required. The meeting with Earth King Kuei in Ba Sing Se demonstrated how political leaders could become trapped by principles that seemed clear in abstract discussion, but proved inadequate when applied to complex realities that defied simple categorization. The Earth King's insistence on complete Fire Nation withdrawal was driven by legitimate concerns about sovereignty and historical justice, but his unwillingness to consider alternatives reflected the kind of rigid thinking that had contributed to the war's duration and intensity. Aang's growing understanding that strict separation between nations might be impossible or even undesirable in the post-war world required fundamental revision of assumptions he had inherited from Avatar Roku and earlier incarnations. The idea that maintaining clear boundaries between cultures was necessary for preventing conflict was challenged by evidence that interaction and integration could create bonds stronger than political divisions, relationships that made war less likely rather than more probable. The Avatar Aang fan club that had emerged spontaneously in Yudao represented both opportunity and responsibility, showing how his reputation could inspire people to preserve air nomad values, while also demonstrating the dangers of allowing others to interpret his teachings without proper understanding of their philosophical foundations. The enthusiasm of these followers was genuine but potentially misdirected, requiring careful guidance to ensure that their efforts served genuine spiritual development rather than mere imitation of external forms. The transformation of the fan club into the first air acolytes marked a crucial step in Aang's approach to cultural preservation, recognizing that air nomad traditions could only survive through transmission to people from other backgrounds who were willing to embrace their essential principles while adapting their practices to circumstances that the original culture had never anticipated. This evolution represented synthesis rather than simple preservation, creating something new that honored the past while serving present needs. The crisis that erupted when Earth Kingdom forces moved to enforce colonial removal orders demonstrated how quickly peaceful intentions could lead to violence when different groups' legitimate interests came into direct conflict. The sight of Earth Kingdom soldiers preparing to forcibly relocate families who considered themselves loyal citizens of communities they had helped build showed how policy decisions made with good intentions could produce outcomes indistinguishable from the oppression they were meant to correct. Aang's intervention to prevent the Battle of Yudao required him to take positions that satisfied no one completely, while trying to preserve relationships that political polarization threatened to destroy permanently. His decision to protect the colonists from forced removal alienated Earth Kingdom supporters who had expected Avatar backing for their legitimate claims, while his refusal to endorse permanent Fire Nation occupation frustrated those who wanted clear victory rather than complicated compromise. The solution that eventually emerged from extended negotiations required all parties to abandon positions they had considered non-negotiable, accepting outcomes that provided partial satisfaction rather than complete vindication of their respective principles. The transformation of the oldest colonies into autonomous regions that owed allegiance to neither the Fire Nation nor Earth Kingdom created precedents for new forms of political organization that acknowledged realities that existing national boundaries could not accommodate. The establishment of the United Republic of Nations represented revolutionary thinking about how political authority could be organized to serve populations whose identities transcended traditional cultural categories. The new nation would be governed by representatives from all backgrounds rather than dominated by any single group, creating institutions that reflected the colonial experience of cooperation across cultural boundaries, while providing political independence from the nations whose conflicts had created these communities in the first place. Republic City, built on the site of the former Cranefish Town, embodied the vision of multicultural cooperation that the United Republic was intended to promote on a larger scale. The city's architecture blended elements from all four nations, while its population included people whose families had originated in every region of the world, creating an environment where diversity was celebrated rather than merely tolerated, and where traditional boundaries mattered less than shared commitment to common goals. Aang's role in Republic City's development went beyond simple oversight to encompass active participation in designing institutions and customs that would enable people from radically different backgrounds to live together peacefully and productively. His air nomad training in conflict resolution and consensus building provided valuable models for governance that emphasized cooperation over competition, while his avatar experience offered perspective on how local decisions could affect broader patterns of international relations. The establishment of Air Temple Island, as both Aang's home and a center for air nomad cultural preservation, created a visible symbol of how tradition could survive and adapt without losing its essential character. The island's location near the heart of Republic City emphasized that spiritual values had place in modern urban life, while its function as a sanctuary for flying bison and other survivors from the pre-war world demonstrated commitment to preserving what could be saved from the past, while building something new for the future. The discovery of additional flying bison who had somehow survived the air nomad genocide provided Aang with hope that other elements of his culture might have endured in hidden refuges or through the protection of people who understood their value even without sharing their origins. Each new bison represented not just recovery of what had been thought lost forever, but validation of choices he had made to preserve rather than simply avenge, to build rather than simply destroy what had caused his people's destruction. The ring-tailed winged lemurs that had evolved from the original flying lemurs during the century of Aang's absence showed how life could adapt and continue, even under the most challenging circumstances, creating new forms that served similar functions while reflecting changed conditions that made exact replication of past species impossible. Their existence provided models for how air nomad culture might evolve without losing its essential characteristics, changing in response to new environments while maintaining the spiritual principles that had made it valuable to the world. The Air Acolytes' progress in learning traditional practices while adapting them to their own backgrounds and circumstances demonstrated that cultural transmission could occur across boundaries that seemed insurmountable, that people raised in completely different traditions could embrace spiritual principles that resonated with universal human needs for meaning and connection. Their dedication to preserving what Aang taught them while making it relevant to their own lives showed how living traditions grew through interpretation rather than simple repetition. The challenges that emerged during Republic City's early years tested every assumption about how multicultural societies could function, revealing tensions and conflicts that idealistic planning had not anticipated, while also demonstrating resilience and adaptability that exceeded what pessimistic observers had expected. The city's success in managing diversity without sacrificing unity provided evidence that the United Republic's founding principles could work in practice rather than merely serving as noble aspirations that reality would inevitably defeat. The criminal organizations that arose to exploit opportunities created by rapid urban development and cultural mixing required new approaches to law enforcement that traditional national authorities were not equipped to provide. The metal-bending police force that Toph established represented innovation in both technique and philosophy, using unique abilities to address unique problems while maintaining standards of justice that served all citizens regardless of their cultural backgrounds or economic circumstances. The economic prosperity that Republic City achieved through trade relationships with all four nations demonstrated how cooperation could produce benefits that conflict could never provide, creating wealth and opportunity that elevated living standards for everyone involved while building practical incentives for maintaining peaceful relationships. The city's success as a commercial center made it valuable to all nations as a partner, rather than threatening to any as a rival, creating stability through interdependence, rather than through dominance or isolation. The cultural innovations that emerged from Republic City's multicultural environment produced art, music, cuisine, and literature that drew from multiple traditions while creating something entirely new that belonged fully to none of the parent cultures while honoring all of them. These creative syntheses provided models for how different ways of understanding the world could enrich each other rather than competing for dominance, showing how diversity could be a source of strength rather than conflict. Aang's marriage to Katara represented personal happiness that had seemed impossible during the dark years of war, but it also symbolized the kind of cross-cultural relationships that the new world would need to embrace if peace was to be more than mere absence of active conflict. Their partnership demonstrated how people from different nations could build lives together that honored both their individual heritages while creating something new that belonged to their children and the future they would inherit. The early years of their marriage were marked by the challenges of balancing personal desires with public responsibilities, finding time for private happiness, while serving the needs of a world that still required Avatar guidance to navigate the complex process of building peace from the ruins of everything that war had destroyed or damaged beyond easy. Repère. Their relationship provided foundation for everything else they would accomplish while serving as reminder that duty without joy was as incomplete as happiness without purpose. As the Harmony Restoration movement evolved into the foundation for new forms of international cooperation, Aang began to understand that his role as Avatar would require adaptation to circumstances that none of his predecessors had faced, challenges that traditional approaches might not be adequate to address successfully. The post-war world would need an Avatar who could facilitate cooperation rather than simply preventing conflict, who could help build institutions rather than merely destroying those that served evil purposes. The wisdom that Aang gained through his experience with the colonial question would influence every subsequent decision he made about how to use Avatar power in service of peace, teaching him that justice was often more complex than it appeared, and that good intentions were not sufficient guarantee against harmful outcomes. The boy who had once seen the world in terms of clear moral categories had learned that wisdom sometimes required accepting ambiguity and working towards solutions that satisfied no one completely while serving everyone's essential needs. The success of the United Republic in providing alternatives to traditional forms of political organization offered hope that other seemingly intractable conflicts might be resolved through creative thinking that abandoned old assumptions in favor of approaches that addressed underlying needs, rather than simply validating historical claims. The precedent established by transforming colonies into autonomous regions showed how seemingly incompatible positions might be reconciled through solutions that transcended the original terms of debate entirely. The months following the establishment of the United Republic brought challenges that tested not only the new nation's institutional foundations, but also the personal relationships that had sustained Team Avatar through their years of shared struggle against the Fire Nations. Tyranny. Among these trials, none proved more emotionally complex than Fire Lord Zuko's desperate quest to locate his missing mother. A search that would require confronting family secrets buried beneath layers of deception, political necessity, and the kind of spiritual intervention that made even seasoned veterans of the war's supernatural elements question the boundaries between possible and impossible. Ursa's disappearance had haunted Zuko since childhood, her sudden absence from the Fire Nation palace, leaving questions that Ozai had refused to answer and Azula had used as ammunition for psychological warfare that cut deeper than any physical wound her brother had ever received. The new Fire Lord's need to understand what had happened to the one person who had shown him unconditional love during his formative years was more than curiosity or sentiment. It represented his attempt to heal wounds that political success could never address, to restore connections that power could not replace. The reluctant alliance with Azula that this search required challenged every instinct that Zuko and his friends had developed during years of treating her as their most dangerous and unpredictable enemy. The princess's confinement in a secure mental institution had done nothing to diminish her intelligence or cunning, while her psychological instability had made her simultaneously more vulnerable and more dangerous than she had ever been during her reign of terror as Ozai's most favored weapon against anyone who opposed Fire Nation ambitions. Azula's knowledge about their mother's fate came with conditions that made cooperation feel like collaboration with evil itself. Her demands for temporary freedom and participation in the search, creating opportunities for betrayal and violence that could undo everything they had accomplished since the war's end. Her insistence that she possessed crucial information that could not be extracted through interrogation or discovered through independent investigation forced them to accept risks that rational analysis suggested were unacceptably high. The journey to Hera began as a search for a person but evolved into an exploration of identity and memory that would challenge everyone involved to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of self and the possibility of redemption. The small village where Ursa had grown up before her arranged marriage to Prince Ozai represented a simpler time when her choices had been her own, when love rather than political necessity had guided her decisions about relationships and the future she hoped to build. The local theatre troupe that had preserved Ursa's memory through performances of Love Amongst the Dragons provided the first concrete evidence that she had indeed returned to her birthplace after disappearing from the palace, though the actors' stories about her brief presence raised more questions than they answered. The woman they described bore little resemblance to the confident Fire Lady who had defied Ozai to protect her son, appearing instead as someone haunted by memories she could not escape, and burdened by guilt that no amount of distance could diminish. The discovery that Ikem, Ursa's childhood sweetheart, had also vanished around the same time suggested a connection that romantic hope made easy to imagine but practical experience warned might be more complex than simple reunion between lovers separated by political circumstances. The forgetful valley where local stories claimed he had disappeared carried spiritual significance that went beyond its function as a geographic feature, its very name, suggesting powers that could alter memory and identity in ways that normal understanding could not encompass. Team Avatar's entry into the Forgetful Valley was preceded by warnings from local residents who spoke of the area's dangers in terms that mixed supernatural dread with practical concern for travelers who might become lost in CERN, terrain that seemed to shift and change according to principles that maps could not capture. The vegetation grew in patterns that defied botanical logic, while the paths that appeared clear from a distance became maze-like once entered, leading visitors in circles that brought them back to starting points they could have sworn they had left far behind. The encounter with Rafa and Misu, the Water Tribe siblings seeking the Mother of Faces, provided Aang with his first indication that their search would require spiritual intervention beyond anything political authority or conventional investigation could achieve. The ancient spirit's reputation for altering physical appearance and erasing memories suggested powers that could explain not only Ikem's disappearance, but also the possibility that Ursa herself had been transformed beyond recognition, even by those who had known her most intimately. The Mother of Faces herself proved to be among the most alien and terrifying spirits that Aang had ever encountered. Her vast consciousness, encompassing knowledge and abilities that made normal categories of identity and memory seem trivial and arbitrary. Her willingness to grant new faces and erase painful memories to those who sought her assistance came with prices that reflected her ancient understanding of how completely such changes could transform the essential nature of those who accepted her gifts. The revelation that the kindly couple Norin and Noriko, who had offered hospitality to the traveling actors and seemed to represent everything stable and nurturing about small-town life, were actually Ikem and Ursa, transformed by the Mother of Faces' intervention, created a crisis of recognition that challenged everyone's understanding of identity and continuity. The people they had become bore no resemblance to their former selves in appearance, memory, or personality, raising fundamental questions about whether they remained the same individuals or had been replaced by entirely different people who happened to occupy the same physical space. Azula's desperate attempt to steal the wish that was meant to help Rafa and Misu demonstrated that even the promise of spiritual transformation could not heal the psychological damage that had made her both victim and perpetrator of the royal family's dysfunction. Her demand for a new face reflected not desire for different appearance, but desperate need to escape an identity that had become synonymous with pain, failure, and the kind of isolation that drove even the strongest minds beyond the boundaries of sanity and reason. The Mother of Faces' anger at being commanded, rather than petitioned with proper respect, threatened to end their mission in violence that would have left crucial questions unanswered, while adding new tragedies to the royal family's already substantial catalogue of loss and separation. Aang's intervention required diplomatic skills that went beyond normal human psychology to encompass understanding of spiritual psychology and the kinds of respect that ancient powers expected from mortals who sought their assistance. The accidental revelation of Rafa's true face beneath the spiritual mask that had hidden his scarring provided Aang with the key to resolving the crisis. Through reference to Avatar Kuruk's previous interaction with the Mother of Kur, Faces, the connection between past and present demonstrated how Avatar experiences accumulated across lifetimes to provide resources for dealing with challenges that seemed unprecedented, but actually repeated patterns established through centuries of spiritual mortal interaction. The restoration of Ursa's original appearance and memories created a reunion that was both joyful and painful, bringing back not only her love for Zuko, but also her full awareness of everything she had sacrificed and everyone she had hurt through choices made under impossible circumstances. The woman who emerged from years of peaceful existence as Noriko was simultaneously the mother Zuko remembered, and someone fundamentally changed by experiences that had given her perspectives on happiness and loss that her previous life had never allowed her to develop. The integration of Ursa's recovered memories with her experiences as Noriko created internal conflict that reflected broader questions about continuity and change that the post-war world was struggling to address on both personal and political levels. Her love for Ikem had been real and transformative, while her life as Noriko had provided peace and fulfillment that her existence as Fire Lady had never permitted. The choice between these identities was not simply about returning to a previous self, but about deciding which version of herself was more authentic and valuable. The celebration of Yangchen's festival represented Aang's attempt to restore air nomad traditions while adapting them to circumstances that the original culture had never anticipated, creating synthesis between preservation and innovation that honored the past while serving present needs. The festival's emphasis on harmony between human and spiritual worlds provided framework for addressing conflicts that pure political solutions had proven inadequate to resolve satisfactorily. The opposition from earth and fire industries demonstrated how economic interests could threaten spiritual values through development that treated sacred sites as merely valuable real estate, rather than locations with significance that transcended commercial calculation. Satoru's factory represented the kind of progress that ignored consequences extending beyond immediate profit and loss, threatening damage that might prove irreversible if allowed to continue without consideration for broader implications. The earthquake that interrupted Aang's spiritual communion with Avatar Yang Chen was not random natural disaster, but manifestation of spiritual anger that had been building beneath the surface for decades, the accumulated resentment of forces that had been ignored or actively suppressed by human development that proceeded without regard for anything beyond immediate human needs and desires. The timing of this geological violence suggested connections between spiritual and physical worlds that modern thinking often dismissed, but ancient wisdom had always recognized as fundamental to maintaining balance. General Old Iron's emergence from the sea brought with it rage that had been accumulating since the death of Lady Tianhai, his spiritual companion, whose murder had been the original trauma that created his hatred of human civilization and his determination to prevent any further encroachment on sacred sites that industrialization threatened to desecrate or destroy. The spirit's size and power made conventional military response impossible, while his justifiable anger made simple appeasement inadequate for addressing grievances that went to the heart of how humans related to the natural world. The battle between Aang and General Old Iron was unlike previous spiritual confrontations because both sides possessed legitimate grievances and reasonable arguments for their positions, creating moral complexity that made victory through superior force seem hollow, even if it proved tactically achievable. The spirit's desire to protect sacred sites from industrial development was admirable, while his willingness to destroy innocent human lives to achieve this goal was clearly unacceptable. The injury that Aang inflicted on General Old Iron during their confrontation was necessary to prevent immediate casualties, but came at the cost of reinforcing the spirit's beliefs about human nature and the impossibility of peaceful coexistence between spiritual and material worlds. The wound was both physical and psychological, adding fresh trauma to ancient grievances while making future cooperation more difficult rather than creating opportunities for mutual understanding and respect. TOEF students, who were trapped in the mine collapse, represented the human cost of conflicts between progress and preservation, their lives endangered not by malicious intent, but by the predictable consequences of industrial development that proceeded without adequate consideration for potential risks or proper preparation for managing dangers that such activities inevitably created. Their rescue required cooperation between traditional earthbending and the innovative metal-bending techniques that TOEF had developed, showing how established skills could evolve to meet new challenges. Lady Tianhai's revelation that she had never truly died, but had instead transformed into a different kind of existence, provided resolution that satisfied both spiritual and practical concerns, demonstrating that apparent conflicts between human needs and spiritual requirements might be resolved through deeper understanding, rather than requiring choice between mutually exclusive alternatives. Her continued love for humanity, despite everything she had suffered, showed that forgiveness was possible, even for wounds that seemed too deep for healing. The transformation of Yang Chen's festival into the Spirit's Friendship Festival represented exactly the kind of creative synthesis that the post-war world required, preserving essential elements of air nomad tradition, while adapting them to serve broader purposes that addressed current needs, rather than simply maintaining historical practices for their own sake. The new celebration honored both human achievement and spiritual wisdom, creating space for cooperation rather than competition between different approaches to understanding the world's fundamental nature. The success of this festival provided precedent for other situations where traditional practices might be modified to serve contemporary purposes without losing their essential spiritual significance, showing how living traditions could grow and develop rather than becoming museum pieces that preserved forms while losing the vitality that had made them meaningful to the people who had created them originally. The celebration became a model for how the air nomad's legacy could influence the modern world through adaptation rather than simple repetition. As the festival concluded and the immediate crisis was resolved, Aang found himself contemplating the lessons that this experience had provided about balancing preservation with progress, spiritual values with material needs, individual desires with collective responsibilities. The quest to find Ursa had evolved into a broader exploration of how people and cultures could change without losing their essential identities, how past and present could be integrated rather than forcing choices between them that diminished both. The success in resolving conflicts between spirits and humans through creative compromise rather than decisive victory provided hope that other seemingly intractable problems might be addressed through approaches that transcended the original terms of debate, finding solutions that served everyone's essential needs while requiring everyone to abandon positions that had seemed non-negotiable when viewed from perspectives limited by assumption and tradition. The growth in Aang's understanding of his role as Avatar reflected broader themes about leadership and responsibility in a world where simple answers were increasingly inadequate for addressing complex problems that required nuanced responses rather than applications of overwhelming force. The bridge between worlds would need to facilitate communication and understanding rather than simply imposing solutions that might address immediate symptoms while ignoring underlying causes that would eventually create new conflicts if left unaddressed. The years following the Spirit's Friendship Festival brought a deceptive sense of normalcy to the world, as if the great dramas of war and reconstruction had finally given way to the quieter rhythms of administration and gradual progress. But beneath this surface calm, tensions were building that would test not only Aang's abilities as the Avatar, but his understanding of how power could be wielded responsibly in situations where traditional approaches proved inadequate for addressing problems that demanded both immediate action and long-term wisdom. The reports that began filtering in from the Fire Nation during the third year of Zuko's reign spoke of mysterious disappearances that followed patterns too organized to be random crime but too subtle to be obvious political rebellion. Children from prominent families were vanishing without trace or ransom demand. Their absence, discovered only after careful searches, revealed that they had never reached destinations they had been expected to arrive at, according to their normal routines and established schedules. The investigation that Aang undertook at Zuko's request revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Fire Nation society, involving people whose loyalty had never been questioned and whose motives seemed to transcend simple political opposition or personal grievance. The missing children had been taken by individuals who possessed intimate knowledge of their families' movements and security arrangements, suggesting either betrayal by trusted associates or surveillance capabilities that exceeded anything conventional intelligence gathering could provide. The Kemurikage that appeared to be responsible for these kidnappings were spirits whose involvement in mortal affairs violated every precedent that Aang's spiritual training had established as normal boundaries between the physical and spirit worlds. These ancient entities had supposedly withdrawn from human contact centuries ago, their retreat marking the end of an era when such beings had been active participants in Fire Nation political life, rather than distant legends that few people took seriously enough to study their historical significance. But the evidence suggested that the Kemurikage currently terrorizing Fire Nation families were not genuine spirits at all, but human imposters using spiritual costumes and psychological manipulation to exploit fears that had deep roots in Fire Nation folklore and cultural memory. The deception was sophisticated enough to fool even experienced spiritual practitioners, demonstrating planning and resources that pointed toward conspiracy involving people with access to rare knowledge and considerable financial backing. Aang's investigation of the Dragonbone catacombs beneath the Fire Nation capital revealed layers of forgotten history that challenged official accounts of how Fire Lords had consolidated power and maintained control over their Tang nation's spiritual traditions. The tombs contained evidence of relationships between early rulers and spirits that had been deliberately obscured by subsequent generations, who found such connections politically inconvenient or spiritually threatening to their authority. The discovery that Azula was leading the fake Kemurikage provided answers to questions about the conspiracy's organization, while raising new concerns about her psychological state and the extent of her influence over people who should have known better than to trust someone whose history of manipulation and violence was well documented. Her ability to inspire loyalty despite her obvious instability suggested charisma that transcended rational calculation, appealing to emotional needs that political stability alone could not satisfy. The rescue mission that followed tested every aspect of the cooperation that had developed between Aang and Zuko during their post-war partnership, requiring them to work together against an enemy who knew their capabilities and limitations better than almost anyone else in the world. Azula's intimate knowledge of her brother's psychology and Aang's moral constraints gave her advantages that superior numbers and elemental mastery could not automatically overcome through conventional tactical approaches. The confrontation in the hidden base, where the kidnapped children were being held, demonstrated how far Azula had fallen since her defeat at the war's end. Her desperation to prove her continued relevance, driving her to actions that served no practical purpose, beyond causing pain to people she blamed for her current circumstances. The children had been treated well physically, but subjected to psychological manipulation designed to turn them against their families and the Fire Nation's new policies of international cooperation. The successful rescue of the missing children provided closure to the immediate crisis, while leaving larger questions unresolved about how former Fire Nation loyalists were adapting to their nation's transformed role in international relations. The conspiracy had attracted people who felt displaced by peace, whose identities had been so thoroughly shaped by war that they could not adjust to circumstances that required different skills and different approaches to finding meaning and purpose in their lives. Azula's escape during the confusion of the rescue operation ensured that the threat she represented would continue to complicate efforts to build stable institutions in a nation still struggling with the legacy of authoritarian rule and militaristic culture. Her ability to evade capture, despite being outnumbered and outmaneuvered, suggested resources and support networks that had not been fully identified or neutralized through the investigation's apparent success. The journey to the Southern Water Tribe that followed provided Aang with opportunities to observe how peace was being implemented in regions where the war's impact had been different from what he had witnessed in the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. The Water Tribes had suffered losses that were devastating but not civilizationally threatening, leaving them better positioned to rebuild traditional institutions while adapting to changed circumstances that required new approaches to old challenges. But the Southern Water Tribe's prosperity and growing international prominence had created internal tensions between those who wanted to preserve traditional ways of life and those who saw opportunity in closer integration with global trade networks and political systems. These divisions reflected broader questions about cultural identity and modernization that every society was grappling with as the post-war world established new patterns of interaction and exchange. Gilak's nationalist movement represented the extreme end of resistance to change, his followers believing that any compromise with foreign influences would lead inevitably to the loss of water tribe identity and the absorption of their culture into homogenized international systems that served other people's interests more than their own. His arguments appealed to genuine concerns about cultural preservation, while offering solutions that required isolation and conflict rather than engagement and adaptation. The attack on Hakoda during the international conference demonstrated how political extremism could threaten not only specific policies, but the basic stability required for democratic governance to function effectively. Gilak's willingness to use violence against water tribe leadership showed that his commitment to preserving traditional culture had evolved into something that threatened the very people he claimed to be protecting from foreign influence and cultural contamination. Aang's intervention in the battle at the Bridge of No Return required him to use avatar power in service of maintaining political stability rather than preventing existential threats to world peace, demonstrating how his role was evolving to encompass responsibilities that were less dramatic but equally important for preserving the foundations that made continued progress possible. The defeat of the nationalist uprising protected democratic institutions while leaving underlying tensions unresolved. The aftermath of Gilak's rebellion revealed how successfully the Southern Water Tribe had adapted to its enhanced role in international affairs while maintaining essential elements of its cultural identity, creating synthesis between tradition and innovation that served as a model for other societies facing similar challenges. Hakoda's leadership had provided stability during the transition, while ensuring that change served the tribe's interests rather than merely accommodating external pressures. The industrial development that was transforming Cranefish Town into a major commercial center brought both opportunities and problems that required new approaches to governance and social organization. The rapid growth that economic success created strained traditional authority structures while creating wealth disparities that threatened social cohesion, if not managed through policies that distributed benefits broadly rather than concentrating them among those who were already advantaged. Lao Beifong's request for avatar assistance in resolving conflicts between benders and non-benders reflected growing tensions that industrialization was creating as traditional relationships between different groups were disrupted by technological changes that altered the relative value of various skills and capabilities. The emergence of factories owned by non-benders created power dynamics that challenged assumptions about how society should be organized and who should hold authority. The sabotage campaign that targeted non-bender businesses was coordinated and systematic, suggesting organization that went beyond spontaneous frustration to encompass deliberate strategy aimed at preventing economic changes that threatened bender privilege and traditional hierarchies. The attacks were designed to create fear and economic damage while maintaining plausible deniability about who was responsible for the destruction. The investigation that revealed Councilwoman Liling as the leader of the Bender supremacist movement demonstrated how political authority could be used to promote sectarian conflict rather than serving the common good, how elected officials might exploit their positions to advance personal agendas that undermined the very institutions they had sworn to serve. Her ability to maintain public respectability while secretly organizing terrorism showed the sophistication of the conspiracy. The confrontation with Liling and her followers forced Aang to make decisions about how avatar power should be used against people whose actions were clearly wrong but whose motivations reflected legitimate concerns about economic displacement and social change. The Bender supremacists were reacting to real problems. even though their methods were unacceptable and their solutions would have created greater injustice than the conditions they claimed to be addressing. The temptation to use energy bending to remove Liling's abilities was strong, offering a clean solution that would permanently end her capacity to cause harm, while avoiding the complications that imprisonment or execution would create. But Aang's growing wisdom about the limitations of Avatar power warned him that such action would address symptoms rather than causes, treating individual cases of extremism while ignoring systemic problems that would eventually produce new leaders with similar grievances and methods. The decision to reject energy bending as a solution to political terrorism reflected Aang's understanding that Avatar intervention should facilitate healing rather than simply removing obstacles. That lasting peace required addressing underlying causes of conflict, rather than eliminating specific individuals who embodied broader social tensions. The technique that had been appropriate for stopping Fire Lord Ozai was inadequate for managing problems that required social rather than individual solutions. The uprising that erupted when Liling's conspiracy was exposed tested the resilience of Cranefish Town's democratic institutions, while demonstrating both the fragility and the strength of communities that were experimenting with Basa, new forms of social organization. The violence was contained relatively quickly, but the underlying tensions that had made it possible remained unresolved and would require sustained effort to address through policy changes and cultural adaptation. The aftermath of the Bender supremacist crisis revealed how industrial development was creating new forms of inequality and conflict that traditional approaches to governance were not equipped to handle effectively. The success in defeating organized terrorism did not eliminate the economic pressures and social changes that had made such extremism appealing to people who felt displaced by forces beyond their control or understanding. Aang's decision to remain in Cranefish Town rather than moving on to other crises reflected his growing recognition that Avatar responsibilities increasingly involved supporting local efforts to build just societies rather than intervening in dramatic conflicts between clearly defined forces of good and evil. The work of building sustainable peace was less glamorous, but more important than the heroic confrontations that had characterized the war years. The ongoing development of Republic City as a model for multicultural cooperation provided both hope and warning about how post-war reconstruction might proceed in other regions, showing what was possible when different groups committed to working together, while also revealing how much effort was required to maintain such cooperation when economic and political pressures created incentives for conflict and tumult, competition. The success in managing the Bender supremacist crisis without resorting to authoritarian solutions demonstrated that democratic institutions could adapt to address new forms of extremism while preserving the freedoms and rights that made such institutions worth protecting. But the experience also showed how much vigilance was required to prevent legitimate grievances from being exploited by people whose solutions would have created greater problems than those they claimed to address. As Aang reflected on the patterns that connected the various crises he had helped resolve during the post-war period, he began to understand that his role as Avatar was evolving from preventing disasters to facilitating the patient work of building societies that were just and stable enough to prevent such disasters from arising in the first place. This shift required different skills and different approaches than those that had served during the war, emphasizing cooperation and understanding rather than the decisive application of superior power. The wisdom that came from these experiences would influence every subsequent decision Aang made about how to use his unique position and abilities in service of a world that no longer needed the Avatar to save it from existential threats, but still required guidance in learning how to live peacefully with the diversity and complexity that freedom and prosperity had created. The bridge between worlds would need to help people understand each other, rather than simply preventing them from destroying each other through conflict that served no one's genuine interests. The challenges ahead would test different aspects of Avatar wisdom than those that had been required during the war, demanding patience rather than decisiveness, facilitation rather than leadership, trust in human capability rather than reliance on cosmic intervention. The boy who had once saved the world through dramatic confrontation with ultimate evil was growing into the man who would help create conditions where such confrontations became unnecessary because people had learned to resolve their differences through methods that served everyone's needs, rather than determining winners and losers through contests of strength. The marriage between Aang and Katara was celebrated not with the grand ceremony that their status as Avatar and Master Waterbender might have warranted, but with the quiet intimacy that reflected their understanding of love as something precious and personal, rather than a public spectacle designed to serve political purposes or satisfy other people's expectations about how such unions should be conducted. The ceremony took place on Air Temple Island as the sun set over Republic City's harbor, its light painting the sky in shades that reminded everyone present of the hope that had sustained them through the darkest periods of the war. The simple exchange of vows that bound them together carried weight that went beyond personal commitment to encompass their shared determination to build a future worthy of all those who had sacrificed so much to make peace possible. Their promises to each other reflected lessons learned through years of facing death together, of supporting each other through losses that had threatened to break their spirits, of maintaining faith in love's power to heal wounds that seemed too deep for any medicine to touch effectively. Air Temple Island itself had been transformed from a barren refuge into a sanctuary that honored air nomad traditions while serving the practical needs of a growing community dedicated to preserving what could be saved from the past while building something new for the future. The buildings that rose from carefully tended gardens combined architectural elements from all four nations, creating harmony that was both beautiful and functional, demonstrating how different approaches to construction and design could complement rather than compete with each other. The flying bison that had found their way to the island during the years following the war represented hope that life could recover from even the most devastating losses, their presence proving that some things thought destroyed forever could return when conditions were right and people were willing to provide the protection and support that survival required. Each new calf born to the growing herd was celebrated as victory over extinction, evidence that dedication and patience could accomplish what force and political maneuvering never could. The ring-tailed winged lemurs that had evolved from their pre-war ancestors showed how adaptation and change could preserve essential characteristics while developing new capabilities that served survival in altered circumstances. Their playful nature remained unchanged despite their modified appearance. Their social bonds still centered around mutual grooming and shared exploration of their environment, their delight in aerial acrobatics, undiminished by the genetic modifications that had made such evolution possible during the century of Aang's absence. The air acolytes who came to study on the island brought enthusiasm and dedication that sometimes exceeded their understanding of the philosophical principles underlying the practices they worked so hard to master correctly. Their mistakes and successes in learning meditation techniques, dietary restrictions, and spiritual exercises that had been second nature to people raised in air nomad culture provided Aang with insights into how traditions could be transmitted across cultural boundaries while maintaining their essential meaning, and culture provided Aang effectiveness. The birth of Bhumi, their first child, brought joy that seemed almost impossible after so many years of loss and struggle, his healthy cries echoing through temple halls that had not heard such sounds since before the genocide that had eliminated an entire civilization. The baby's vigorous movements and curious exploration of his immediate surroundings suggested personality traits that would make parenting an adventure, requiring patience, creativity, and the kind of flexibility that air nomad philosophy had always emphasized as essential for navigating life's inevitable changes. The decision to name their son after King Bumi reflected both honoring friendship that had survived a century of separation and hope that the child would develop the kind of wisdom that could find joy and insight in circumstances that seemed to offer only difficulty and confusion. The eccentric monarch's ability to see possibilities that others missed, to solve problems through approaches that conventional thinking would never consider, provided a model for the kind of creative intelligence that the post-war world would need to address challenges that traditional methods had proven inadequate to resolve. But the responsibilities of parenthood, combined with Aang's duties as Avatar and his commitment to rebuilding air nomad culture, created tensions between competing demands that sometimes seemed impossible to balance without neglecting something important. The infant, who needed constant attention and care, could not understand why his father sometimes had to leave on missions that served the greater good, while the world that required Avatar intervention could not wait for domestic considerations to be resolved satisfactorily. Katara's support during this period was both practical and emotional, her understanding of Aang's cosmic responsibilities, enabling her to manage household needs while he dealt with crises that only the Avatar could address effectively. Her own capabilities as a master waterbender and healer made her valuable partner rather than dependent spouse, someone who could contribute to their shared goals while maintaining her individual identity and pursuing her own interests in advancing women's rights and medical knowledge. The arrival of Kya 3 years later brought new dimensions to their family dynamic, while testing their ability to provide equal attention and affection to children whose needs and personalities were developing in different directions. The daughter, who bore her grandmother's name, showed early signs of waterbending ability, combined with the kind of adventurous spirit that made supervision challenging for parents who understood all too well the dangers that curiosity could create in a world still recovering from wars. Devastation. Kya's waterbending manifested through play rather than formal instruction. Her unconscious manipulation of bath water and drinking cups, demonstrating natural talent that required guidance and structure to develop safely and effectively. But her abilities also created opportunities for bonding with her mother that Bumi could not share, establishing patterns of special relationships that would influence family dynamics for years to come, while potentially creating feelings of exclusion that parents would need to address carefully. The birth of Tenzin 7 years later completed their family, while creating new challenges about how to balance Avatar duties with parental responsibilities that were becoming increasingly complex as the children developed distinct personalities and individual needs that required different approaches to guidance and support. The youngest child showed signs of airbending ability from his earliest months, his unconscious manipulation of air currents suggesting that he might be the one to carry forward the elemental traditions that had been Aang's primary inheritance from his destroyed people. Tenzin's airbending potential created pressures and expectations that his older siblings did not have to bear, his father's eagerness to pass on air nomad culture sometimes overwhelming the child's need to develop at his own pace and according to his individual interests and capabilities. The intensity of instruction that Aang provided reflected not impatience with his son's progress, but desperate awareness that he might be the last person capable of transmitting knowledge that would otherwise be lost forever when he died. The family trips to various air temples for cultural education and spiritual development provided opportunities for shared experiences, while also emphasizing how much of air nomad civilization had been lost during the genocide that had preceded Aang's awakening from ice. The ruins that they explored together told stories of communities that had thrived for centuries before being destroyed in campaigns that had targeted not just people, but the cultural knowledge and spiritual practices that had made their society unique and valuable. The restoration work that occupied much of Aang's attention during these years required balancing historical accuracy with practical necessity, recreating buildings and facilities that could serve contemporary needs, while honoring the architectural principles and aesthetic values that had made the original temples both beautiful and functional. Each decision about materials, design, and purpose required careful consideration of how modern requirements could be accommodated without compromising the essential character that made these places sacred rather than merely useful. The collection of air nomad recipes that Aang attempted to recreate from memory and fragmentary written sources proved more challenging than rebuilding physical structures, requiring ingredients that were no longer available and preparation techniques that had died with the people who had practiced them daily. His experiments with substitutions and adaptations sometimes produced results that satisfied hunger without capturing the flavors and textures that had made these foods important elements of air nomad cultural identity. The gardens that were established at each restored temple attempted to recreate the agricultural systems that had sustained air nomad communities through centuries of peaceful existence. But many of the plant varieties that had been cultivated by his people were extinct, their seeds and growing knowledge lost along with the people who had maintained them. The substitutes that had to be used changed not just flavors, but the entire relationship between the communities and their environment, altering practices that had been central to air nomad spirituality. The library that Aang assembled through careful collection and preservation of surviving air nomad texts created a resource that future students could use to understand the philosophical and practical foundations of the culture he was working to preserve and transmit. But the gaps in this collection were enormous. Whole areas of knowledge represented only by fragmentary references that hinted at sophisticated understanding that had been lost forever when the genocide eliminated the people who had carried such wisdom in their memories. The training regimens that Aang developed for teaching airbending to Tenzin and the air acolytes combined traditional exercises with modifications that accommodated the reality that most students came from backgrounds that had not prepared them for the physical and mental demands that air nomad education had traditionally imposed on children raised from birth within the culture. The adaptations that were necessary sometimes felt like compromises that weakened the transmission of authentic knowledge, but they were essential for making the teachings accessible to people who brought different strengths and limitations to their studies. The pressure that Tenzin faced as the only airbending child in the family created dynamics that Aang struggled to manage fairly. His awareness that his youngest son carried unique responsibilities for preserving air nomad traditions, sometimes leading to expectations and demands that were inappropriate for someone so young. The intensity of his father's attention was both privilege and burden, providing access to knowledge and experience that was unavailable to anyone else while creating obligations that limited normal childhood exploration and play. Bhumi's feelings of exclusion during family activities that focused on airbending instruction or air nomad cultural practices reflected broader questions about identity and belonging that mixed families faced throughout the post-war world. His father's heritage was rich and meaningful, but it was also something he could not fully share or inherit, making him feel like observer rather than participant in traditions that seemed to matter more to his parents than his own interests and capabilities. Kia's acceptance of her position between her brothers, sharing some experiences with each while being fully included in neither airbending instruction nor the complete freedom from cultural expectations that Bhumi's lack of elemental abilities provided him, demonstrated the kind of flexibility and emotional intelligence that would serve her well throughout her life. Her waterbending abilities gave her access to her mother's world, while her air nomad heritage connected her to traditions that she could appreciate without being expected to preserve single-handedly. The stories that Aang told his children during their bedtime routines attempted to preserve air nomad oral traditions while adapting them for young audiences who needed to understand their cultural heritage without being overwhelmed by the tragic circumstances that had made such preservation necessary. The tales of previous avatars, ancient spirits, and the philosophical principles that had guided air nomad society were modified to emphasize hope and possibility rather than dwelling on loss and destruction that could create anxiety rather than inspiration. The keepsakes and mementos that Aang assembled for Tenzin's eventual inheritance represented his attempt to create tangible connections to air nomad culture for someone who would never experience it as a living tradition supported by community and daily practice. Each object carried stories and significance that could be explained, but never fully transmitted to someone who had not grown up surrounded by the context that had made such items meaningful to their original owners and users. The balance between family responsibilities and avatar duties became increasingly difficult as the children grew older and their individual needs became more complex and demanding. Crisis situations that required immediate avatar intervention could not be postponed to accommodate school performances or family celebrations, while important family moments could not be rescheduled to accommodate global emergencies that only the avatar could address effectively. Katara's role in managing these competing demands required her to serve as both primary parent and avatar support system, ensuring that the children's needs were met while also providing Aang with the emotional stability and practical assistance that his cosmic responsibilities required. Her strength in handling these multiple roles made their family life possible, while sometimes leaving her own individual needs and interests subordinated to everyone else's requirements. The guilt that Aang felt over missing important moments in his children's lives due to avatar responsibilities was balanced by recognition that the peace and stability he worked to maintain were essential for giving them the kind of future that made personal happiness possible. The sacrifices required by cosmic duty were real and painful, but they served purposes that extended beyond individual family welfare to encompass the well-being of everyone who would benefit from continued peace and international cooperation. The legacy that Aang hoped to leave his children went beyond air nomad culture or avatar powers to encompass values and principles that could guide their lives, regardless of their individual abilities or the specific challenges they would face. The importance of compassion, the necessity of standing up for justice, the value of preserving what was precious while remaining open to change. These lessons could serve them whether they became benders or politicians, parents or adventurers, leaders or followers in the great work of building a better world. As the children reached adolescence and began developing their own identities and interests, Aang found himself needing to balance his desire to share his knowledge and experience with respect for their autonomy and their right to choose their own paths through life. The father, who had once been the last of his kind, was learning to accept that his children would be something new, rather than simply continuation of what had come before. That successful preservation required evolution rather than mere repetition of established patterns and traditions. The crime that began to spread through Republic City's streets during the later years of Aang's life was unlike anything the young metropolis had previously experienced. Organized with precision that suggested military training while operating according to principles that seemed to transcend normal categories of greed or political ambition. The victims reported experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of bending and the limitations that governed how elemental abilities could be used against unwilling targets, their accounts describing violations of autonomy that were more intimate and terrifying than simple robbery or assault. Yakone's rise to power within Republic City's criminal underworld had been gradual and methodical, his organization expanding its influence through techniques that left no physical evidence while creating psychological trauma that prevented victims from seeking help or providing useful testimony to authorities who might have been able to investigate his activities effectively. The bloodbending that he wielded without the full moon's enhancement violated every principle that waterbending masters had established about their art's limitations, demonstrating abilities that seemed to require fundamental revision of everything that was understood about elemental manipulation. The reports that began reaching Aang through official police channels described crimes that were both impossible, according to established theory, and undeniably real, according to the testimony of victims whose credibility could not be questioned effectively. Wealthy merchants found their bodies moving against their will while their shops were systematically looted, their attempts to resist or call for help thwarted by manipulation of their nervous systems that left them conscious, but helpless to protect themselves or their property from violation. Chief Toph's investigation of these unusual crimes was hampered by the absence of conventional evidence and the reluctance of victims to provide detailed accounts of experiences that challenged their understanding of their own agency and autonomy. The earthbending sensors that could detect lies were useless when people were telling truth about events that seemed impossible, while the metal-bending techniques that had revolutionized law enforcement proved inadequate for addressing crimes that left no physical traces beyond their psychological impact on those who had suffered them. The pattern that emerged from careful analysis of incident reports revealed organization and planning that went far beyond opportunistic criminal activity, suggesting systematic campaign designed not just to generate illegal profit, but to demonstrate power that transcended normal understanding of what waterbending could accomplish when properly motivated and creatively applied. The crimes seemed designed to inspire fear as much as to acquire wealth, creating an atmosphere of vulnerability that made everyone feel potentially helpless regardless of their individual capabilities or social position. Aang's personal investigation began with interviews of victims who were willing to discuss their experiences with someone whose avatar status provided both authority to investigate and spiritual insight that might enable understanding of techniques that conventional analysis could not explain satisfactorily. The conversations that followed were difficult for everyone involved, requiring people to relive trauma while describing violations of their bodily autonomy that felt more intimate than physical assault, despite leaving no lasting physical damage. The technique that Yakoni employed was clearly bloodbending, but its application during daylight hours and without full moon enhancement suggested mastery that exceeded anything recorded in waterbending texts or preserved in cultural memory from before the war's disruption of traditional educational systems. The ability to manipulate another person's circulatory system and nervous functions through waterbending required not just exceptional skill, but philosophical approach that treated other human beings as objects to be manipulated, rather than fellow conscious entities deserving of respect and consideration. The moral implications of bloodbending's existence forced Aang to confront questions about the relationship between elemental abilities and ethical behavior that his air nomad upbringing had not prepared him to address adequately. The technique itself was not inherently evil, but its applications seemed inevitably to involve violations of consent and autonomy that made it incompatible with the spiritual principles that were supposed to guide all forms of bending toward harmony rather than domination. The collaboration between Avatar and police that eventually tracked Yakone to his base of operations required coordination between very different approaches to law enforcement. Aang's spiritual insights, complementing Toph's practical experience, while her metal-bending capabilities provided tactical advantages that conventional investigation techniques could not match. The combination of avatar power and police methodology created effectiveness that neither could have achieved independently, while demonstrating how traditional and innovative approaches could strengthen each other. Quan's cuisine served as front for criminal operations that were far more sophisticated and extensive than the initial investigations had suggested. The restaurant's legitimate business, providing cover for activities that reached throughout Republic City's commercial and political establishments. The building's design incorporated security measures that were both conventional and elemental, creating defensive positions that could be maintained against attack, while providing escape routes that took advantage of waterbending mobility and the urban environment's complex infrastructure. The confrontation that followed tested every aspect of Yakone's bloodbending mastery against avatar power that he had clearly studied and prepared to counter through techniques that exploited the limitations and vulnerabilities that even cosmic abilities could not eliminate completely. His attacks were precisely targeted to disrupt Aang's bending abilities, while avoiding the kind of dramatic violence that might trigger avatar state responses that his planning could not anticipate or control effectively. The initial success of Yakone's bloodbending in overpowering Aang, despite the avatar's superior elemental abilities, demonstrated how thoroughly the crime lord had studied his opponent's capabilities and developed countermeasures that exploited specific weaknesses in avatar power. The technique's effectiveness against someone of Aang's abilities was both terrifying and educational, revealing vulnerabilities that future enemies might also discover and exploit if proper precautions were not developed and maintained. Toph's resistance to Yakone's bloodbending proved more effective than Aang's initial efforts, her earthbending connection to solid ground, providing stability that liquid-based manipulation could not completely overcome, while her practical experience with non-conventional combat situations enabled her to adapt quickly to threats that theoretical training had not prepared her to face. Her metal-bending students' coordination during the arrest demonstrated training and teamwork that complemented their unique abilities effectively. The trial that followed Yakone's capture became a test of Republic City's legal institutions and their ability to address crimes that challenged established categories of evidence and testimony while dealing with a defendant whose abilities posed ongoing threats to courtroom security and public safety. The legal precedents that were established would influence how future cases involving unusual bending abilities would be prosecuted, creating frameworks that balanced individual rights with community protection needs. Yakone's confident assertion that he would escape conviction reflected understanding of legal systems and their limitations that suggested corruption or intimidation extending throughout Republic City's government and judicial establishments. His casual attitude toward the charges against him indicated either delusional thinking or access to resources and influence that the prosecution had not anticipated or prepared to counter through conventional legal procedures and investigative technique. The courtroom attack that Yakone launched when his conviction was announced demonstrated blood-bending capabilities that exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates of what his abilities might encompass. His manipulation of everyone present showing mastery that approached supernatural levels of precision and control. The technique's effectiveness against multiple targets simultaneously suggested practice and refinement that had been developed through systematic experimentation on unwilling subjects over extended periods. Aang's initial helplessness against Yakone's enhanced bloodbending revealed how completely the crime lord had prepared for this confrontation. His technique, specifically designed to exploit avatar vulnerabilities while preventing the kind of spiritual responses that might otherwise provide escape from physical manipulation. The experience of being controlled so completely was traumatic in ways that went beyond immediate physical danger to encompass existential questions about autonomy and free will that would influence Aang's thinking for the rest of his life. The avatar state that eventually enabled Aang to break free from Yakone's control was triggered not by conscious decision, but by desperate response to threats that endangered not just his individual existence, but the continuity of the avatar cycle itself. The cosmic power that flowed through his consciousness provided protection against blood-bending manipulation, while enabling pursuit of someone whose escape would have made him untouchable through conventional law enforcement methods and legal procedures. The chase through Republic City's streets tested both participants' abilities under conditions of extreme stress and physical exhaustion. Yakone's blood-bending providing mobility advantages that were balanced by Aang's air scooter technology and superior knowledge of urban geography. The pursuit demonstrated how quickly situations could escalate from legal proceedings to life or death confrontations when dealing with criminals whose abilities transcended normal categories of threat assessment and tactical planning. The final confrontation between Avatar and Crime Lord took place under circumstances that made conventional arrest procedures impossible, while requiring immediate resolution of threats that endangered not just immediate participants, but potentially everyone in Republic City who might become targets. If Yakone's escape enabled him to continue his criminal activities, the isolation that surrounded their battle created space for techniques and decisions that would not have been appropriate in more public settings. Yakone's desperate attempt to kill Aang rather than accept capture revealed how thoroughly his commitment to power had corrupted his understanding of acceptable behavior. His willingness to murder someone whose only crime was interfering with illegal activities, showing complete abandonment of moral constraints that might have enabled rehabilitation or redemption. The attack was calculated and deliberate, designed to eliminate permanently the only person capable of stopping his criminal empire through direct confrontation. The energy bending that Aang employed to remove Yakone's abilities permanently was applied under circumstances that met all the criteria that the Lion Turtle had established for safe use of the technique. The Crime Lord's actions, having demonstrated moral corruption so complete that spiritual intervention was justified to prevent future harm to innocent people. The process was more difficult than it had been with Fire Lord Ozai. Yakone's resistance reflecting both his powerful will and his intimate understanding of his own abilities and their sources. The removal of Yakone's blood-bending was both punishment and mercy, eliminating his capacity to harm others while preserving his life, and providing opportunity for reflection and possible redemption that execution would have foreclosed permanently. The technique left him physically healthy but spiritually diminished, unable to access the elemental abilities that had enabled his crimes while retaining all other aspects of his identity and memory. The aftermath of Yakone's defeat brought both relief and concern to Republic City's population. His capture, eliminating an immediate threat, while raising questions about what other individuals might possess similar abilities and whether existing legal and law enforcement institutions were adequate to address such challenges. Effectively, the case established precedents for dealing with extraordinary criminal capabilities while revealing vulnerabilities in urban security that would require ongoing attention and resource allocation. The physical toll that the confrontation had taken on Aang was more severe than he initially realized. The stress of being controlled through bloodbending, having created damage to his nervous system and circulatory functions that would influence his health for the remaining years of his life. The experience had also created psychological trauma that was difficult to process. Memories of helplessness and violation that challenged his understanding of Avatar power and its limitations under certain circumstances. The years that followed the Yakone crisis were marked by Aang's growing awareness that his body was aging more rapidly than his chronological age would suggest. The centuries spent in ice, having created biological stresses that were beginning to manifest through various symptoms and limitations that conventional medicine could not address effectively. The avatar state that had preserved him through suspended animation had also accelerated certain aging processes in ways that would shorten his natural lifespan significantly. The conversations with healers and spiritual advisors that Aang sought during this period confirmed what he had begun to suspect about his mortality. The unique circumstances of his preservation and revival having created conditions that made predicting his remaining lifespan impossible through normal methods, while suggesting that time was more limited than his apparent physical condition would indicate to casual observers. The preparation for death that occupied increasing amounts of Aang's attention during his final years involved both practical arrangements for the continuation of his work and spiritual preparation for the transition that he knew was approaching. Despite his relatively young chronological age, the instructions he provided to the White Lotus about locating and protecting his next incarnation reflected lessons learned from his own experience about the challenges that young avatars faced when discovering their identity and responsibilities. The final years with Tenzin provided opportunities for intensive instruction in air nomad culture and philosophy that went beyond simple technique to encompass the spiritual foundations that would enable his son to preserve and transmit traditions that might otherwise be lost forever when Aang's death ended the last direct connection to pre-war air nomad civilization. The teaching sessions were both educational and emotional, father and son sharing knowledge and experiences that created bonds transcending normal family relationships. The conflict resolution methods that Aang taught Tenzin during their final years together reflected his mature understanding of how air nomad principles could be applied to contemporary problems while maintaining their essential character and effectiveness. The techniques emphasized listening and understanding rather than winning arguments, seeking solutions that served everyone's needs rather than determining victors and vanquished through competitive processes that left underlying problems unresolved. Katara's support during Aang's declining health was both practical and spiritual, her healing abilities providing whatever relief was possible, while her presence offered emotional comfort that made the approaching transition less frightening and more acceptable. Their conversations during this period covered not just immediate concerns, but their shared memories of everything they had experienced together, their love serving as foundation for facing separation that would be permanent until the Avatar cycle brought them together again in some future incarnation. The death that came to Aang at the biological age of 66 was peaceful and expected, his family surrounding him with love and support that made the transition from life to whatever lay beyond consciousness feel natural rather than tragic. His final words were expressions of gratitude for the extraordinary life he had been privileged to experience, the relationships that had sustained him through impossible challenges, and the opportunity to serve as bridge between worlds during a period when such service had been desperately needed. The immediate rebirth as Korra ensured the Avatar cycle's continuation while beginning a new chapter in the eternal story of consciousness, dedicated to maintaining balance between spiritual and material worlds. The Avatar spirit carrying forward lessons learned through Aang's lifetime, while adapting to new circumstances that would require different approaches to familiar challenges of preserving peace and promoting justice throughout this world. And so concludes the extraordinary journey of Avatar Aang, the last airbender who became the bridge between worlds. From a playful monk child to the master of all elements, from a boy who ran from responsibility to the man who restored balance to the world, Aang's story reminds us that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to preserve and protect. His legacy lives on in the Air Acolytes, who keep his culture alive, in Republic City, where all nations live together, in the family he raised and the values he instilled. Most importantly, his spirit continues in Avatar Korra and all who come after, an unbroken chain of wisdom and compassion stretching across the ages. As you drift toward peaceful slumber, carry with you Aang's most important lesson: that every life has value, that hope can survive even the darkest times, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose love over fear, understanding over judgment, mercy over vengeance. Rest well, knowing that somewhere the Avatar's spirit watches over the world, eternal guardian of balance and peace.